Hey, what is up, mortals? Welcome to Season 1 Part 2 of What If Quirks Were Outlawed. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into the story. Their gazes snapped to the green-haired boy in tandem. All of them were bewildered by his declaration, though all for different reasons. At that moment, it felt like the combined weight of their trepidation was smothering the life out of him. Midoriya's mouth felt like it was packed with cotton. He swallowed sharply. What the hell are you talking about, Midoriya? Bakugo barked, still reeling from his traumatic head injury. Did you drill some of your idealistic trash into this boy's head? Stain parted his lips into a snarl, dark beaded hues drilling into Toshinori with contempt. No, I can assure you that I didn't. The blonde-haired vigilante laughed nervously, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know what made him want to say anything like that. I thought I painted a pretty poor picture of our lives. Actually, you didn't, Mr. Toshinori, Midoriya interjected, finally regaining his footing. The young man wouldn't allow his savior to backtrack and talk he and his friends down for the sake of convincing him. He may have only been a youth, but the consequences of choosing such a restless life bore onto him relentlessly. Just taking one look at these men, and he knew that their lives were nothing if not tumultuous. Me and Bakugo, he started, clearing out the cobwebs in his throat with a soft cough. We don't have any direction in our lives. I'm going to end up as some salaryman. Green eyes glassed the scene until they met with Bakugo's. Midoriya's expression softened. And Kaken is something special. I don't want to see him tortured anymore just because his quirk is good. Wells of water welled up in his eyes, though the ball of his thumb dispatched of them almost immediately. Now was not the time to show weakness. He deserves to be able to use that quirk for good. And I can help too, even if I'm quirkless. Somehow, some way, I don't know. The youth gazed at his shoes, fully realizing just how much of a stretch it was for this idea to come into fruition. It was then that a firm hand met his shoulder. I once knew someone like us. I think these two remember him fondly as well. He didn't have a quirk either, Toshinori started, tilting the boy's chin up to look him in the eyes. His aura was so warm, yet waning. There was something terribly wrong with him, but Midoriya was hard-pressed to discern what. The old man seemed ill, yet he did just as much work as us. Tore through the drug trade like a man on fire. I'm sure you can make a difference too, young man. He wheezed and sputtered, sinking to a squat as his fist eclipsed his mouth. Knuckleduster was a good man. We really shouldn't rope these kids into our mess, though. You know that's irrational, Aizawa added, massaging his eyes with a thumb and forefinger. If you think it's because we're weak, we're not. I can handle myself. Bakugo growled. Shades of his tenacity always found a way to peek through the veil. The atomic blonde couldn't help himself when it came to proving a point, even if it wasn't a point he necessarily wanted to prove. You wouldn't stand a chance out there, boy. You were nearly snuffed out by a gang of snot-nosed street rats and some quirkless middle schooler had to save you. Don't get cocky, Stain hissed, each word dripping with venom so emphatic that even the aggressive young man had no choice but to back down. This one was different than the other two, far more ominous. They could feel his conviction emanating from him like a cloud of black, suffocating smoke. Why you weren't there? Bakugo retorted weakly. The young man could barely stand up straight due to his injury. All the yelling caused veins to bulge from his temples like worms wriggling through loose dirt. If I were, then nobody would have died, you little brat. Sharp and poignant, like a dagger digging into both of the boys' hearts. These kids don't belong here, Toshinori. Stop imposing this foolish optimism on anyone who lends you an ear. You'll get more people killed. Every word Stain uttered stung with the pressure and malicious intent of a bullet. Even this phrase seemed to negatively affect the older vigilante, causing him to cast a forlorn gaze away from everyone. That was a bit much, Toshinori replied. They're just children. Let them have their fantasies. I don't do this to let teenagers frolic around like everything is okay. It won't be okay until the AQTF and all the dirty little cretins of this town are called. That's not fair. The green-haired boy spoke up in defense. Kaken and Mr. Toshinori put everything on the line to help people. Kaken fought tooth and nail against several people trying to kill him. And if you don't think that is worthy of respect, then you aren't similar to Mr. Toshinori at all. I never called myself a hero, kid, Stain replied. But that's fair. Do what you want, I don't care. The room settled into an uncomfortable silence. The masked vigilante went back to scraping his knives against a whetstone, acting as if nothing had transpired at all. He still harbored that frightening intensity, even in the dense quiet that accompanied them. Midoriya dug his chin into the webbing of his hand, staring pensively in no particular direction. These three seemed tied together more by circumstance than by camaraderie, especially Toshinori and Stain. Their ideas on how to solve crime were disconnected from one another, with the tired-eyed man serving as some sort of mediator to bridge the gap. Could he and Bakugo really fit into such a disjointed group? Would it even be an intelligent decision to try and dive headlong into a profoundly immoral underbelly at their age and skill level? most importantly, with this world completely revealed to them, a stark juxtaposition of how they once lived, could they turn away and return to their normal lives? Could he live with that bearing down on his conscience? Midoriya shook his head. Let's do it, Midoriya. The freckle-faced teen turned his attention to the voice, almost shocked to find that Bakugo said it. What? The reply was instinctive. Let's be heroes, or vigilantes, or whatever the hell these guys are. Time to show that bastard what we're made of. Stain glanced up with ire tainting his ruby irises at the backhanded comment. What do you say? The young man clutched the back of his skull, obviously still under the effects of a serious concussion. Of course, Kakin. The Viridian-haired teen flashed his most winning smile, glad to find his old friend at the same place he was. Before we get back into the story, I would like to say that we've got a second channel called Anime Deep Dive. Anime Deep Dive goes over the hard facts of the anime presented. Now, in case you guys didn't know, we have a third channel called We The Celestial Naruto What If. We The Celestial Naruto What If mainly focuses on our Naruto What If series. If you are interested in content like this, please go check the description below or click the eye icon in the top right corner. Now with that out of the way, let's get back into the story. The boys hadn't steeled themselves for what was to come. The level of physical exertion and mental fortitude it took to keep up with these storied veterans was nothing to scoff at. They were barely 15 when they had to tighten those shivering hands and look towards the future. From their perspective, molding their bodies and spirits into what their mentors needed seemed just short of insurmountable. Bakugo always had the tenacity to keep him from faltering. His sheer force of will had enough strength to erode mountains and shape oceans. All the atomic blonde had to do was put his mind to it, and there wasn't a thing in existence that had the gall to block his path. The dogged youth would just burst through whatever obstructed him to the other side. Perhaps not unscathed, but better because of it. He flourished in strife. Midoriya, on the other hand, had never experienced this level of punishment. His experience as an adolescent was a decidedly average one, with menial goals and lackluster hobbies. What fueled him was his unwillingness to subscribe to that restless life. That little spark, realizing that there was more than just a well-paying job and school and friends, it single-handedly wrought a fighting spirit in the pit of his chest. With tear-soaked cheeks and burning lungs and taut muscles brining in lactic acid, he refused to quit. Even without a quirk, with no advantage and no previous combat experience, he met his much more adventurous comrade's pace. It took every ounce of conviction he had to continue on this tumultuous journey. And when he came out the other side, dismantled whole and rebirthed, he smiled in spite of it. Bakugo grimaced beneath his ballistic mask. It was their first foray into the criminal underworld alone, and it had already turned sour. The anti-quirk task force bastards never did anything on this side of town. Why'd they have to turn up now? He and Midoriya, beneath the dull shroud of night, hunkered behind the shielding embrace of a shipping container as the so-called protectors of the peace prowled like ravenous hyenas. The sounds of their heavy combat boots spurning the concrete floor of the warehouse caused the boys to wince. Some concerned citizen had phoned them after the blonde engulfed a handful of thugs with a controlled blast. Nothing too extreme either, just enough to put them out of commission until the police arrived. The prevailing issue, though, was that not all of the criminals had been dealt with yet, and, more importantly, they were meant to be gone by the time the brass turned up on scene. Instead, the duo of neophyte vigilantes were under the scrutiny of a dozen or so highly trained, ready-to-kill security officers bolstered by full support of the government. Slow, shallow, silent breaths escaped their lips. Nothing could have prepared them for this. Emerald eyes crept around the container, peering down a narrow pathway into the nearest clearing. His hues met the gaze of another, one of the criminals that they were meant to dispatch of. His chest heaved like a bellow, his sharp features contorted into primal fear. The young ruffian cleared his throat a little too loud, an action he immediately regretted. In a fluid motion with the fluidity of water and the suddenness of a car accident, one of the agents whipped around the corner with a backfist to the boy's nose. His body impacted the cover he had so recently found solace in with a dull thump. The adolescent was reduced to one knee, clutching his battered face as the officer dug the steel toe of his boot into his chin. This time, much to Midoriya's shock, the urchin barely budged. His skin had calcified, turning the once terrified miscreant into a stalwart force of nature. An uppercut to the solar plexus, a haymaker to the jaw, shattered goggles, a frayed balaclava. The burgeoning belligerent picked the task force agent apart on the feet until he slumped to the ground, losing consciousness. Sweltering heat flooded the corridor as the boy's body imprinted against the opposing cement wall. The sheer force shattered the stone like glass, a cascade of splintered concrete skittering across the ground like insects retreating from an upturned stone. Billowing flames consumed hallway as a singular, ominous silhouette split through the oppressive orange and gray. This was someone they both recognized. Enji Todoroki, codenamed Endeavor. His visage contorted into scowl as he glowered down at the incapacitated boy. "We have to do something," Midoriya blurted out in a hushed tone. "What the hell are you talking about? It's just some criminal." his partner responded, clenching his jaw at the sight of such a staunch opponent. The freckle-faced teen's legs shifted on their own. He launched himself at full throttle, defying every ounce of trepidation that permeated through the synapses in his brain. It didn't matter who the person was, so long as he saved them in their time of need. The look in that bastard's eyes wasn't that of a protector. He was a killer, through and through. He planned to scorch that poor, helpless teen until he amounted to nothing but charred bone. A metal mandible locked around his frown. A flick of a wrist deployed his baton. His other hand tugged a tear gas grenade from the chest rig, donning his toned form. With the pluck of a pin, a plume of smoke emanated from the nozzle at its head. It skidded across the ground and enveloped the scene entirely. Now the green-haired boy had time to think. Or so he hoped. Scorching, palpable heat bellowed down the corridor and threatened to eviscerate him where he stood if it wasn't for the swiftness of his partner in crime. Both of the boys slid down an adjacent hall. Midoriya found himself practically hyperventilating from the adrenaline pulsing through his body. Oh God. Izuku swallowed sharply. Shit, you could have died. Let's G. Bakugo swiveled his head just as Endeavor stepped around the corner. As the red-haired demon raised his hand to cremate the vigilantes, a tetrad of throwing knives seamed his forearm. He howled, immediately withdrawing the arm and bringing his attention to the culprit. Stain launched from out of view with a spinning heel kick that put the enforcer nearly through the steel wall of the nearest shipping container. Can't you cretins stay out of trouble? Stain growled, voice laden with contempt. His gangly fingers tugged at the hilt of his katana. Thank you all for watching the video to the end. Now there are a few more things that I'd like to go over before the video ends. On behalf of We the Celestials, I'd like to thank the writer for this video, as well as the editors for this video. Their details will be in the description. If you're a voice actor, editor, or writer, or you're interested in becoming one of those, go to the Discord that is in the description of this video and hit up the head of one of those areas. We're always looking for members to join us. That's it from us for today's video. So thank you all for watching, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you're interested, and hit that like button if you liked the video. Until next time, peace out mortals, have an amazing day. Hey, what is up, mortals? Welcome to Season 1 Part 3 of What If Quirks Were Outlawed. I just wanted to greet you guys by just saying, sit back and relax, you're in for a treat. So, we begin. Bakugo and Midoriya were shocked, for they didn't expect to see this. In front of them was none other than Stain, pushing back the flaming figure that was Endeavor. The two boys were still unsure of what to do until the crimson-clad vigilante walked up to them. What are you doing? Get out of here, Stain shouted, sounding more aggressive than he used to. Midoriya jumped upon hearing this, but he quickly recovered as he said, I'm not leaving without him. With a relatively calm voice, Stain got annoyed as he tightened the grip he had around his sword. You wish to sacrifice your life for a petty criminal? The crimson vigilante growled, letting his anger grow more and more by the second. Midoriya was startled by Stain's sudden burst of anger, but he didn't let show as he answered, that petty criminal is nothing more than a broken and forsaken child. If we don't help him, we don't deserve to call ourselves H with the same voice as before. But he didn't get to finish before Stain interrupted him. I've already told you, I'm not a hero, Stain shouted with more anger. Midoriya's was silent for a while, as his gaze slowly made its way to the ground. Thinking that he had won the argument, Stain turned his back on the two boys, trying to focus his attention on Endeavor. Human, a voice then said, slightly trembling as it did. Stain turned his gaze back to the two boys, only to see that Midoriya was looking straight at him with a cold gaze. I was going to say human, the green-haired boy finished, his voice still trembling. These words took Stain by surprise, for it was unexpected. The desire to help anyone, regardless of who they are, is a trait reserved for heroes. Midoriya's statement claimed that everyone wants to help others, and Stain couldn't get over the truth behind those words. The crimson-clad vigilante gritted his teeth as he turned his attention back to the almost recovered Endeavor. I'll hold him off, grab that kid and get out of here, Stain then grunted, before he leaped into battle. Both Midoriya and Bakugo were surprised to hear these words come out of Stain's mouth, but they quickly shrugged it off before they began to move. You better know what you're doing, Bakugo said to his green-haired friend, as they made their way past Endeavor. Midoriya didn't budge upon hearing this, as he quickly answered, I hope I do, with a trembling voice. The two boys then managed to sneak by the flaming giant that was Endeavor, but it didn't go unnoticed. The flaming agent saw them run past him, but he was too distracted by Stain to do anything about it. The two vigilantes swiftly made their way over to the beaten boy, carefully observing him as they did. He was unconscious, his black hair was singed and covered in blood, and part of his face was now burned. Midoriya felt a hint of anger enter his body like venom. and the cause of that anger was the AQTF agent that had done this. The green-haired boy looked over to his blonde companion before they both nodded and proceeded to pick up the wounded teen. His body was limp and heavy, but fortunately he was still alive. "Let's move," Bakugo growled as he looked at his green-haired companion. Midoriya gave his partner a neutral look before he nodded in response. The two then proceeded to slowly and carefully move away from the scene in an attempt to not draw any unnecessary attention from Endeavor. The two were just about to leave, but were abruptly stopped. The second that they took a step, they could hear the sound of a loud bang, followed by the sound of fire. The duo turned their expressions towards the source of the sound, only to be horrified. What they saw was a crimson-clad man with burns and bruises lying on the ground. It was Stain, and he was in bad shape. What happened next only served to horrify the teens even more. Approaching the injured vigilante was none other than the flaming titan himself, Endeavor, and he looked to be in bad shape. He was limping as he moved, had numerous bleeding cuts, and he looked like he was on the verge of collapsing. Endeavor looked furious as he charged towards Stain in a jet of flame, intent on ending it now. Midoriya didn't even think. He just let go of the broken teen before he rushed ahead. The green-haired boy delivered a punch to the face of the flaming giant, drawing blood from his nose. Midoriya stood guard in front of Stain, as Endeavor recovered with more rage than before. He then charged once again, only to get blasted in the chest by an explosion. "Can you give me a heads up next time you plan on running face first into danger?" Bakugo shouted, prompting Midoriya to look at his blonde companion. Bakugo grunted loudly before he spoke up. "It looks like we're not leaving without a fight, so how do we beat a guy that is a giant when compared to us?" the blonde asked, sounding more calm than before. Bakugo's words made Midoriya focus, for he noticed something odd about Endeavor's approach. He only charged straight ahead, even after being hit, and stopped whenever he did. It was as if he didn't know any other way of moving. But why was that the case? Midoriya's eyes went wide when he finally realized the answer. It wasn't that Endeavor didn't know any better. He physically couldn't do it any other way. The flame giant's frame was one of the things that made him so formidable, but now it's become a liability. The alleyway they were standing in was cramped, as such it limits his mobility. Midoriya and Bakugo are much smaller in comparison, and right now it has become their greatest strength. Not only that, but Endeavor didn't look to be in his best condition. That's his weakness. He's too big. The alleyway is so cramped that he can only move forward and backwards, whereas we are small enough to be able to move almost freely. It also looks like he could collapse at any moment, so we probably have the advantage right now, the green-haired boy said with uncertainty as he took a stance. Bakugo looked surprised upon hearing this, until he looked and realized that it was true. Endeavor didn't have much mobility right now, unlike he and Midoriya. The blonde grinned widely upon this realization, as he too took a stance before saying, "Let's kick his ass." With a confident voice, Endeavor finally recovered from his staggered state, as he began to flare up and charge at the teens. He prepared a flaming fist, readying himself to cremate the vigilantes, but was hit by another explosion instead. The giant staggered back once more and received another punch from Midoriya, which was followed by another explosion. Midoriya and Bakugo continued with this strategy for a long while, whittling Endeavor down little by little. The flaming agent knew what would happen if he let this continue, and he refused to go down. Out of nowhere, a burst of flame erupted from Endeavor, knocking both Bakugo and Midoriya back. After that, he charged at them both, bearing the full intent to kill them. Midoriya was the first to act, as he got back up and faced Endeavor. The green-haired boy had acted out of instinct, and every movement made had been subconscious. The raging Endeavor closed in on him, and Midoriya responded by throwing a powerful kick straight into the jaw of his flaming opponent. All of the force from his charge had been added to the kick, and it caused Endeavor to fall backwards with the disgusting sound of bones breaking. During this time, Bakugo got up and fired one final explosion towards Endeavor, making him crash hard into the ground. The duo panted heavily as they stared at the now unconscious Endeavor. Bakugo then looked at Midoriya before saying, "I'm not following you on any more suicide missions," with a slightly annoyed tone before continuing to pant. The green-haired boy shrugged off his partner's comment as he went to see if Stain was okay. Bakugo noticed Midoriya's intention and proceeded to follow his lead. The two made it over to Stain and slowly sat him up. Before Midoriya spoke, "Are you okay?" with a worried tone. Stain shivered slightly upon hearing this, before he coughed loudly and responded, "Why are you still here?" the crimson-clad vigilante asked, voice being weighed down by pain and injury. Midoriya was a little more concerned, but he remained calm as he answered, "We faced a burning obstacle on the way." Stain was confused upon hearing this, until he strained his eyes and looked more carefully. Now he was suddenly shocked and taken by surprise, for he could clearly see the unconscious body of Endeavor lying in front of him. Did you?" Stain uttered, but didn't finish his sentence. Like he said, "We faced a burning obstacle and overcame it," Bakugo then said, as if he was answering the man. Stain was still in shock, but he quickly breathed a sigh of relief before trying to stand up. Bakugo and Midoriya noticed this effort and helped him up. After Stain was back on his feet, Midoriya shifted his gaze over to the still unconscious teen he had tried to save. He was injured, and he definitely needed help. "Can you help Stain? I'll carry that one," Midoriya said to Bakugo, while pointing his thumb to the unconscious individual. The blonde grunted at first, but he still nodded as a response. Midoriya left Stain to Bakugo, before proceeding to carry the heavy and limp body of the injured teen. The group then slowly made their way out of the alley, carefully walking to avoid attention. Upon returning with Stain and the injured teen, Midoriya and Bakugo were immediately helped by Toshinori and Aizawa. They were both relieved to see their companions alive and well, but that quickly changed when Aizawa's gaze landed on the injured teen that they had dragged with them. "Who is that?" the tired man asked, sounding a little annoyed. Midoriya looked a little scared at first, before he calmed himself and answered. He was getting beaten half to death by Endeavor, and he needed help. With a somewhat calm voice, Aizawa was still annoyed, as he then commented, "So you brought a stranger to our secret hideout." Midoriya froze upon hearing these words, for what he had done could have been bad. This stranger that he dragged with him could potentially sell them out, and it would be his fault if that happened. The green-haired boy calmed himself a little, after realizing that this was no different from what Toshinori had done to him and Bakugo. "I only did the same as Toshinori," Midoriya then said, calming himself down as he did. Toshinori felt proud upon hearing this, that the kid he saved went on to return the favor by saving someone else, but his joy was quickly drowned out by the extremely angry glare of Aizawa. "All right, what happened to Endeavor?" Toshinori then asked, trying to change the topic. Midoriya and Bakugo looked at each other, but they didn't get to answer before Stain spoke up. "They beat him up. By the looks of it, he was unconscious with a broken jaw," the crimson-clad vigilante said, sounding much calmer than he usually was. Both Aizawa and Toshinori were shocked to hear this. Not only did the teens manage to defeat Endeavor, but the way Stain had said it was like he was complimenting them for the first time. Everyone looked at Stain with a weird look, until he returned to his usual demeanor by asking, "What do we do about him?" While looking at the unconscious teen, everyone returned to their usual selves as they looked at the boy. "Let's cure his injuries first. Then we'll talk when he wakes up," Toshinori then said, sounding calm. Everyone looked at the blonde man with neutral expressions, before they all nodded in perfect unison. Some time passed, and the vigilantes all helped to cure the injuries of both Stain and the boy. After that, Toshinori, along with Midoriya and Bakugo, took the boy to a separate room so that they could speak when he woke up. Stain and Aizawa weren't with them, for they didn't want to talk with the kid. The trio all sat next to the boy and patiently waited for him to wake up, and it was a long wait. "He sure is taking his sweet time to wake up," Bakugo exclaimed, sounding quite annoyed. Midoriya briefly glanced at his blonde friend, as he responded by saying, "He was beaten half to death. What did you expect from him?" With a voice that hinted at nervousness, as if he was trying to enlighten Bakugo on the circumstances. Bakugo grunted in response to this, for he knew that his green-haired friend was right. "You need to have more patience, young Bakugo," Toshinori then said, his voice proud and booming as usual. Bakugo didn't respond once again, for right as Toshinori finished his statement, they could hear a pained groan coming from the boy. The trio all turned their attention towards the boy, and watched as he slowly regained his awareness. "Where the hell am I?" the boy exclaimed, as he quickly looked at his surroundings. Toshinori was the first to act, as he stood up and said, "Calm down, you're somewhere safe," with a reassuring voice. The boy turned his gaze towards the trio, before he began to panic and shout, "Who are you? Are you with the AQTF?" Quite aggressively. Both Midoriya and Bakugo were caught off guard by the boy's sudden burst of anger, but they really shouldn't have been. The last thing that the boy probably remembered was being beaten senseless by an AQTF officer. It makes sense for him to turn on the defensive side. No, we're the opposite in fact. On Toshinori, these two are Izuku Midoriya and Katsuki Bakugo. They actually saved you from the AQTF officer that nearly killed you, Toshinori then said, explaining the situation and introducing the trio in one go. The boy calmed down a little, as he slowed down his breathing. "So you're vigilantes?" the boy then asked, sounding like he was genuinely surprised. Toshinori just smiled at this reaction, as he answered, "Indeed we are," with a joyous tone. The boy was wide-eyed upon hearing this, for it had been unexpected. He knew of the existence of vigilantes, but this is the first time that he's ever encountered one. Toshinori was quite joyful when seeing the boy's reaction, but he changed his manner as he cleared his throat before asking, "Young man, what is your name?" With a calm voice, the boy looked at Toshinori quite conflicted, as if he didn't want to share his name before he fought against it, and answered, "It's Eijiro Kirishima." With a conflicted voice, Toshinori kept his previous demeanor as he continued to speak. "Well, young Kirishima, can you tell us what you were doing out there?" the blonde man asked, trying to remain as calm as possible. Kirishima looked away for a second, trying to avoid the question, but the more he avoided it, the more he realized that he couldn't run away from it. I was with a group of friends. We went there for supplies, the boy answered, clearly showing that he didn't like talking about it. Toshinori was about to ask another question, but was cut off by the slightly aggressive tone of Bakugo. What would you need supplies for? The blonde asked, sounding like he was attacking Kirishima. The black-haired boy didn't take this lightly as he responded, we live on the street and have absolutely nothing. Why do you think that we need supplies? Kirishima said angrily, as if he was severely offended by Bakugo's statement. Bakugo looked away with a passive-aggressive expression as the room fell silent. No one knew what to say, for it was clear that Bakugo had killed Kirishima's desire to speak. The silence remained for an unbearable amount of time, until Kirishima moved to stand up. Toshinori looked at the injured boy with concern as he asked, what are you doing? With a voice that clearly showed his concern. Kirishima remained aggressive as he answered, I'm leaving, I need to find my friends, before standing up and balancing himself on one of the walls. Toshinori was even more concerned now as he said, I wouldn't recommend that. You haven't fully recovered why, but was cut off by Kirishima, who shouted, I'm leaving. In pure annoyance, Toshinori was distraught as he realized that Kirishima had had enough of them. The exit is over there, the blonde man then said, sounding defeated as he pointed to a door that was across the room. Kirishima didn't hesitate for a second as he walked his way to the exit. The trio of vigilantes were all still and silent, but for different reasons. Midoriya hadn't said a single word during this entire event, for he had been carefully listening to everything that Kirishima had said. There was something in his words that intrigued him, and he decided to act on said intuition. The green-haired boy got up from his seat before jogging to catch up with Kirishima. The black-haired boy could clearly notice the presence of Midoriya, but he paid it no attention. How are you going to find your friends? Midoriya asked with a hint of concern, not wanting to make the other teen any angrier. Kirishima didn't look at Midoriya as he answered, I know where to look. Without stopping, the green-haired boy expected an answer that was similar to this, so asked a follow-up question, and if they're not there? The green-haired boy asked. Kirishima didn't change his manner as he quickly answered, then I'll keep looking. A part of Midoriya was happy to hear this, for it meant that Kirishima would stop at nothing to find his friends. What concerned him is what came next. Would they continue a life of crime on the street and eventually be caught? Or would they change their ways? The two then reached the door, where they abruptly stopped. Kirishima grabbed onto the doorknob, but he didn't open it when he heard what Midoriya said. Why don't you join us? Like you said, you have nothing. If you're with us, you can fight and make a difference, the green-haired boy said, voice sounding as calm as he could manage. Kirishima couldn't take these words seriously at first, for it sounded too much like a joke in his ears. But when he turned to see Midoriya's eyes, he realized that it wasn't a joke. The green-haired boy was being dead serious. He was inviting Kirishima to their band of illegal crime fighters, and he didn't even show a single hint of hesitation. Kirishima didn't know how to react to this, for Midoriya was an alien to him. His conviction and dedication was something that he had never encountered before, and dare he say that it was contagious. The teen clenched his fist in conflict, for the thing he wanted to do didn't align with what he needed to do. I need to find my friends, Kirishima then said, before turning back to the door. Midoriya had hoped for another answer, but he was still happy with what he got. The black-haired teen hadn't answered his question, which made him believe that he was considering it. All right, just do us a favor and keep this place a secret, the green-haired boy then said, sounding just as calm as before. Kirishima looked at him once more and said, don't worry, your secret is safe with me. It's the least I can do for you. Before leaving through the door, Midoriya smiled upon hearing this. He had no concrete proof that Kirishima would keep his promise, but at the same time he had no reason to believe that he would sell them out. The green-haired boy proceeded to walk his way away from the door, realizing that both Bakugo and Toshinori had already joined Aizawa and Stain in the other room. Meanwhile, at another location, far away from the vigilantes' hideout, was an unordinary man. This man was going through the reports of the most recent events, and it served to both shock and confuse him. The report mentioned that a fellow officer of the AQTF, codenamed Endeavor, had been defeated and injured. That alone was intriguing, but what served to shock the man was the description of the suspects. They were teenagers, mere teenagers. The fact that someone so young managed to overpower and defeat Endeavor was hard to believe, even when considering the fact that he was outnumbered. Just what are you really? The man asked himself, as he actively tried to figure out who these young and mysterious vigilantes were. Outro. Thank you all for indulging yourselves in the story thus far. I hope you enjoyed it. Now, there are a few more things that I'd like to go over before the video ends. Firstly, we've got a second channel called Anime Deep Dive. Anime Deep Dive goes deep into the facts and lore of a wide variety of anime. It's sure to expand your weeb knowledge for all kinds of series guaranteed. On top of that, we have a third channel called We The Celestials Naruto What Ifs. It's what we do on this channel already, but in the vast world and lore of Naruto. Go check it out if you're in the mood for some jutsu action. Secondly, on behalf of We The Celestials, I'd like to thank everyone involved in the production of today's awesome content. Their details will be in the description below. Lastly, if you're interested in what we do here at We The Celestials, then I would like to extend out an invitation to join the team. The only caveat being we only accept members 16 years and up to join our crew. You can sign up for whichever category fulfills your interests by joining the recruitment Discord using the link in the description below. Our Discord is an all-around fantastic place to be. Whether you're a fan or looking to join our band of misfits, we're always looking for members to join us. Well, that's it from us for today's video. So, thank you all for watching, and have a great day. Hey, what is up, mortals? Welcome Season 1 Part 4 of What If Quirks Were Outlawed. I just wanted to greet you guys by just saying, sit back and relax, you're in for a treat. So, we begin. Following Endeavor's defeat at the hands of two teenaged vigilantes, the AQTF increased their manpower. This meant many more patrols and investigations to find and capture their vigilantes. The public, however, were kept in the dark on their reasons. The AQTF knew that there would be those that supported them no matter what, but there would also be those who supported the vigilantes. If they found out that a vigilante group had managed to take out Endeavor, an infamously powerful agent of the AQTF, they would be more motivated to fight back and spread their ideas. As for the vigilantes themselves, they became more cautious with their actions. Stain was still recovering from his bout with Endeavor, but it didn't stop them from working. Bakugo and Midoriya continued patrolling on their own, making sure to be extra careful about their decisions. The two were told to keep an eye out for any of the criminals that might have escaped from the grasps of the AQTF that night. But Midoriya couldn't help but worry about something else. It was about Kirishima. The teen had told them that he wasn't alone that night, that he was with some of his friends. Midoriya was subconsciously trying to find said friends, even though he wouldn't be able to tell them apart. He had a strange feeling that Kirishima wouldn't be able to locate them that easily, and that they were in deep trouble since they might have escaped from the AQTF. Hey nerd, don't go dozing off on me. The angry voice of an explosive blonde whisper shouted. Midoriya was knocked out of his thoughts as he jumped and looked at his mask-wearing companion. Bakugo looked at the slightly nervous Midoriya, getting more annoyed as he then turned towards the chaotic streets below them. Where are those damned crooks? How long do they plan on hiding? The blonde exclaimed aggressively, silently cursing the criminals that they needed to find. Midoriya looked at his companion nervously as he answered his question. They're probably hiding from the AQTF. I don't think they're going to show themselves anytime soon, the green-haired boy said, with a slightly trembling voice. Bakugo's gaze locked itself back onto Midoriya, as if he was even more annoyed, before he said, "Of course they aren't. So how are we supposed to find them?" Sounding like he was progressively getting more annoyed and angry by the second. Midoriya jumped a little upon hearing this, not expecting the hyper-aggressive tone, but he understood why Bakugo was annoyed. The AQTF were almost everywhere, making their movement hard enough in the first place. The fact that they had to try and find criminals that were actively hiding just made things way harder than they needed to be. These setbacks made their job difficult, but Midoriya thought of something that could perhaps make it easier. I guess we could start by searching the places where the AQTF are least likely to be at, the green-haired vigilante said, but his unsure tone made it seem like he thought that it was a bad idea. Bakugo looked at Midoriya with a passive-aggressive expression until he calmed down a little. So the less likely we are at finding the AQTF bastards, the more likely we are at finding the damned criminals. I like the sound of that, the blonde then said, as a slight grin formed underneath his mask. Midoriya was shocked to hear Bakugo not be angry with him, for he had been nervously waiting for that type of reaction. So he was genuinely surprised to hear Bakugo speak to him like that. The change of tone and manner didn't last for long, however, until Bakugo walked past Midoriya and said, "Let's get moving already." With his usual aggressive voice, Midoriya tried to remain as calm as possible as he followed his companion on their patrol. The two vigilantes went on their search, looking through places that they thought the AQTF wouldn't be present. They managed to find some activity this way, but it didn't look like anyone was one of the criminals that they were looking for. The duo continued their efforts, stopping and doing what they could whenever they found themselves at an encounter. They made their way around the area, but they never found the people that they were looking for. Bakugo grew frustrated after repeatedly coming up empty-handed, so much so that Midoriya almost had to stop him from destroying something with his quirk. "Calm down, you might draw unwanted attention," Midoriya said in a hushed tone, trying to stop his blonde companion. Bakugo just got more irritated, as he said, "I welcome that attention if it means that the crooks will show their ugly mugs." With an aggressive voice, Midoriya jumped and trembled from Bakugo's aggression, for he almost thought that the blonde was going to attack him. The two continued to argue quite loudly for God knows how long. But it mostly consisted of Bakugo shouting like an animal while Midoriya cowered. Their argument was cut short, however, by the sound of a pained scream coming from an alleyway. Both vigilantes stopped to look in the direction of the scream, only to have Midoriya running in without thinking just a split second later. Bakugo got annoyed and shouted for his companion, but the green-haired boy didn't hear any of it as he ran with full speed. It was weird, but he felt that he needed to rush. Midoriya felt that someone was in trouble, and didn't think before running in. He needed to do something, or he at least needed to try. The green-haired boy rushed through the alley, before turning a right towards where he thought that the scream had come from. He was confused, however, when he arrived and saw no one there. Midoriya's worry skyrocketed as he began to search the area with his eyes, but was interrupted when Bakugo barged in and shouted, "Hey nerd, don't run off like an idiot," but was cut off when something small, but heavy, struck him in the head. The mask-wearing blonde fell limp and unconscious to the ground, and only now did Midoriya fully process what had happened, while the green-haired vigilante tried to shout, but was cut off by something strong coming out of nowhere and striking him in the skull. Midoriya's vision grew hazy as he lost his strength. Once on the ground he looked ahead, only to see the feet of some stranger before everything went black. When Bakugo woke up he couldn't see clearly. His vision was hazy, and it didn't help that it was almost pitch black wherever he was. His body also felt tired, as if he barely had any strength left. Bakugo slowly regained some of his power and vision and tried to move, only to find that he couldn't. He looked down and could faintly see what looked to be a long rope tied around him. The blonde immediately tried to break free, but quickly found that it wasn't possible. Another realization then dawned upon him. He wasn't wearing his mask anymore. Bakugo took a deep breath, regaining his senses as he tried to recall what had happened. Someone had knocked him out and must have dragged him here, and that person had seen his face. The blonde then took a sharp breath as he remembered that he wasn't alone before being knocked out. He tried to look around himself, but to no avail. He then started to pull at the ropes, and was met with a weird resistance. It was as if someone else was tied up at the other end behind him. This suspicion was then confirmed when Bakugo heard grunts of pain from the other side of the pillar he was leaning against. He quickly turned his head towards this newly awoke person as much as he could, for this could only be one person. "Hey nerd, are you awake?" The blonde whisper shouted, praying deep down that this was the person that he hoped it was. He anxiously waited for a response, until it came like a wave of relief. "Yeah, I'm awake," the grunting and audibly pained voice of Midoriya answered, sounding like he was even more disoriented than Bakugo. The blonde let out a deep breath, one that he didn't know he was holding, before he asked another question. "Are you okay?" Sounding a little calmer than before, Midoriya grunted in more pain, as he tried to lift his heavy head before answering. "My head feels like it had a nitroglycerin injection." With a voice that seemed to be restrained from all the pain, Bakugo was relieved that Midoriya's most prominent, and hopefully only, injury was a severe headache, but he made sure that the green-haired boy wouldn't notice this. "Where are we?" Midoriya then asked painfully, finally regained enough awareness to realize his situation. None of them got to make any further observations, however, before the room suddenly lit up. Both vigilantes staggered after suddenly being blinded, as they strained their eyes towards the source. It looked to be a floodlight of sorts, and behind it was a weird figure. "So you're finally awake. You had me waiting for a long while," the figure then said with a cold voice. Bakugo and Midoriya were still adjusting to the blinding light. Therefore they couldn't make out any details of the man's appearance. "Now, who are you?" the man then asked, his voice remaining as cold as ever. The vigilantes didn't know who this man was, but they still knew enough to not tell him their names. They run around and break the law on almost a daily basis, so they shouldn't be throwing their names out randomly. "Depends on who's asking," Bakugo shouted, quite aggressively, towards the mysterious man. The figure was silent for a moment, until he walked into the light to finally reveal himself. The two teens didn't recognize this man, but they didn't need to in order to know that he was their enemy. The label on his suit that read AQTF was more than enough to make that judgment. The man's expression was calm and stern, as he sat himself down on the floodlight before saying, "I am Murai Sasaki, also known as Sir Night-Eye. I think that you both know where my affiliations lie, so will you tell me who you are now?" Bakugo and Midoriya were frozen with fear, for they were in an incredibly bad position. They had essentially been captured by an AQTF officer, and there didn't seem to be a realistic way of getting away. What makes matters worse is that they don't know what type of quirk Night-Eye has, and he has seen their faces. Bakugo tried to hide his panic, as he tried to think of a way out of this. Their best bet would be to fight their way out, but even that came with its own problems. Night-Eye had taken all of their equipment, making them unarmed if not accounting for his quirk. But to fight they first needed to break free. And how were they supposed to do that? The blonde could feel himself panic more, until the sensation of something cold and sharp landed on his palm. Bakugo was confused and tried to feel for it, only to realize that it was a small knife. He then turned his head towards Midoriya, who was looking back at him. The green-haired boy was hiding his panic as well, but he was calm enough to do something. Bakugo quickly realized that Midoriya must have taken inspiration from Stain, and had hidden a small knife so far up his sleeve that Night Eye couldn't find it. Bakugo calmed his nerves, for a hope in the shape of a knife that he couldn't see had appeared. If Midoriya could cut them loose, they could get the jump on Night Eye, which is what they needed in order to escape. They just had to be discreet while distracting the agent through a conversation, and they had to do it without spilling any vital information. Did you bite your tongues, or are you just ignoring me? Night Eye then said, knocking both teens out of their somewhat mutual thought process. Bakugo immediately diverted his energy to talking, while Midoriya began chipping away at the ropes. What do we look like to you? You a QTF bastard. Bakugo scowled, quickly returning to his old abrasive self. Night Eye was unaffected, as he walked closer to them both and said, what do you look like to me? Does lawbreaking, pathetic, mask-wearing brats with attitudes ring a bell? His cold voice never changed in the slightest. Bakugo got more angry upon hearing this, and he could tell that Midoriya didn't like it either, but there wasn't anything they could do. Not only were they tied up, but Night Eye wasn't wrong with his observation. The hard truth was that they were lawbreaking, mask-wearing brats with attitudes, and they happened to be in a pathetic state right now. Bakugo didn't respond to the man, he just grunted to show his distaste. Night Eye was still unaffected, however, as he continued by saying, I think the two of you already know this, but it was reported that Endeavor was defeated by a group of vigilantes. Not only that, but the prime suspects right now happen to be two mask-wearing teenagers, just as coldly as before. Both Bakugo and Midoriya could feel themselves sweat nervously, but they did their best to hide it. The AQTF knew enough to tell that Endeavor was taken down by teenagers, but Night Eye spoke as if that was all that they knew. There probably weren't that many to choose from when talking about teenage vigilantes, but there still wasn't enough evidence to say that it was them. So as long as they didn't confess, they would probably be all right. But for how long? Bakugo felt his hand towards the spot that Midoriya had been chipping away at the ropes, only to find that he was almost at the end. The blonde felt a wave of relief and prepared himself to jump onto Night Eye, but was confused when he felt that Midoriya suddenly stopped sawing. Bakugo was confused and looked towards his companion, only to find that Night Eye was standing in front of him with just a few inches of distance between them. It just so happens to be that I have caught myself two mask-wearing teenagers with attitudes, and I can't help but wonder if you had anything to do with Endeavor's unexpected defeat. Night Eye then said, his voice changing to a more intimidating tone. Midoriya shivered upon hearing this, desperately trying to break eye contact with Night Eye as he answered, I don't know what you're talking about. The green-haired boy answered, shaking nervously. Night Eye was quiet for a while, until he placed his hand on Midoriya's shoulder while saying, sorry, let me correct myself. Only one of you seems to have an attitude, just as coldly as he had before. Midoriya was still nervous, as he slowly looked into the cold eyes that were hiding behind Night Eye's glasses. The agent then let go of the green-haired vigilante, before making his way over to Bakugo. The blonde was covered in a cold sweat, as the man kneeled down in front of him and did the same as he had done to Midoriya. He placed his hand on his shoulder, looked him in the eyes, and asked, would you happen to know anything about it? With a voice that was reeking of cold intimidation. Bakugo was shook ever so slightly as he remained silent. This man's cold air and intimidating aura was unlike anything he had ever felt before. It was outright terrifying. The blonde didn't know what to do and almost panicked, but he calmed himself when hope returned to him. The ropes were loosened, loose enough for him to break free with an explosion. This only meant one thing, that Midoriya had finished his carving of the ropes. Not only that, but he had done it at the most perfect time. Night Eye was directly in front of him and dare he say defenseless. There was no better time to get the jump on him than now. Did you bite your tongue again? Night Eye asked, impatiently waiting for Bakugo's response. The blonde just grinned as he answered, no, right before launching himself towards Night Eye with an explosion. The ropes flew about, breaking both vigilantes free. Bakugo threw his attack towards Night Eye, but to his surprise the agent managed to avoid it flawlessly. The blonde got more annoyed and launched himself for another attack, only to have it meet the same fate. Bakugo was then left wide open, and he could clearly see Night Eye close in to attack him. But his save and grace came in the form of Midoriya, who charged from behind the agent, knife in hand. The blonde couldn't help but grin, for it looked good. Night Eye couldn't see Midoriya coming. As such, he shouldn't be able to avoid him, but he would soon realize that it was all for naught. Night Eye turned around with haste, before hitting Midoriya with a powerful kick to the side. The green-haired boy slid back across the floor, roaring in pain, before the agent turned his attention back to Bakugo. The blonde didn't have a chance to wipe his own grin off his face before Night Eye grabbed him by the arm and slammed him into the ground. Bakugo had the wind knocked out of him as he watched Night Eye stare at them ominously. The man fixed his glasses back into place before speaking. I saw this coming, but I welcomed it, because now I can force you to talk. he said, voice sounding more ominous than anything they've ever heard before. Bakugo tried to force himself up, so did Midoriya, but they couldn't. The pain was too great, but that's not all. They were afraid, because in front of them was a dark presence of an evil government that had no issue with inflicting severe injuries. The two boys shivered even more, as Night Eye slowly made his way over to them. He had pulled out some strange item from his pocket, holding it like it was some sort of weapon, as he readied himself to attack. Bakugo and Midoriya closed their eyes and shielded themselves, waiting for it to be over when they heard a weird sound. They thought that Night Eye was going to attack again, but instead it sounded like something else had come and hit him. They opened their eyes and immediately couldn't believe them. In front of them was a scarred teen, roughly the same age as them, with black hair. They couldn't see his face, for he had his back turned towards them, but they didn't need to see it to know who he was. His arms were held outwards, looking like hardened rocks, as he turned to face the vigilantes. Both the blonde and green-haired boy felt a little relieved, as the black-haired teen grinned while saying, "Do you guys look for trouble, or does trouble find you?" Outro. Thank you all for indulging yourselves in the story thus far. I hope you enjoyed it. Now, there are a few more things that I'd like to go over before the video ends. Firstly, we've got a second channel called Anime Deep Dive. Anime Deep Dive goes deep into the facts and lore of a wide variety of anime. It's sure to expand your weeb knowledge for all kinds of series guaranteed. On top of that, we have a third channel called We The Celestials Naruto What Ifs. It's what we do on this channel already, but in the vast world and lore of Naruto. Go check it out if you're in the mood for some jutsu action. Secondly, on behalf of We The Celestials, I'd like to thank everyone involved in the production of today's awesome content. Their details will be in the description below. Lastly, if you're interested in what we do here at We The Celestials, then I would like to extend out an invitation to join the team. The only caveat being we only accept members 16 years and up to join our crew. You can sign up for whichever category fulfills your interests by joining the recruitment Discord using the link in the description below. Our Discord is an all-around fantastic place to be, whether you're a fan or looking to join our band of misfits. We're always looking for members to join us. Well, that's it from us for today's video. So, thank you all for watching, and have a great day. Hey, what is up, mortals? Welcome to Season 1 Part 5 of What If Quirks Were Outlawed. I just wanted to greet you guys by just saying, sit back and relax, you're in for a treat. So, we begin. Kirishima had just wandered around, trying his luck with the areas that he was going to. He hadn't found his friends yet, and he was growing worried because of it. He thought that he would find them at the places he initially thought of looking at, but he didn't know what to do when he came out empty-handed. There was one other place he could think of, but both him and his friends knew that nothing good came their way from that place. The black-haired teen was discouraged at that point, knowing that he wouldn't be able to do this on his own. He needed help, and he could only think of asking the vigilante group for it. That was when he heard a pained scream come from an abandoned building, and his curiosity got the better of him. That led him to his current situation, standing in front of the same two vigilantes that he knew, after punching away what looked to be an AQTF agent. The black-haired teen looked at the two vigilantes in silence, until Bakugo spoke up. "What the hell are you doing here, you petty criminal?" the blonde said, sounding quite aggressive. Kirishima got annoyed upon hearing this, as he responded by saying, "Is that how you talk to the guy who just saved your sorry ass?" With a similar amount of anger, Bakugo looked at his savior, annoyingly, as he answered, "I never asked for your help," just as aggressively as before. Kirishima's annoyance seemed to rise hand in hand with Bakugo's, as he then said, "Yet you so desperately need it." Bakugo got more angry upon hearing Kirishima's comment, and the two proceeded to argue with no regard towards anything else. Midoriya slowly got up and watched the two with confusion written all over his face, until he noticed that Night Eye was getting up on the other side of the room. The green-haired boy panicked, as he shouted to the other two teens, "Can the two of you save it for later? We have bigger problems to deal with right now." Both Bakugo and Kirishima stopped after hearing Midoriya shout, which Bakugo knew was not something he usually did. The two then turned their attention towards Night Eye, and quickly readied themselves. "So what's the deal with this guy?" Kirishima then asked, hoping to find out what he had gotten himself into. That is when Bakugo answered by saying, "He's called Sir Night Eye, and that's about all we know," with a voice that was still angry. "Be careful, he's fast, and he appears to have incredible reflexes," the green-haired boy said, a little nervously, as he held up a small knife. This answer helped Kirishima a lot more, because now he at least had an idea of what they were dealing with. It didn't make it ideal, but it was better than nothing. The black-haired teen watched as the individual called Night Eye slowly got up to his feet once more, before carefully analyzing the trio that was in front of him. He then looked directly at Kirishima, quite curiously, before speaking. You seem to be well acquainted with these two. Perhaps you'll give me the answers that they refuse to give. Can you perhaps tell me about their involvement with Endeavor's recent defeat? The man said, sounding cold and intimidating. Kirishima finally knew why his two companions were being targeted. It was for saving him. It made him feel a little guilty to be the cause of their problems right now, but he was a little too angry to let it affect him. The way Night Eye spoke had pissed him off, for it sounded like he was defending Endeavor. Yeah, I'll tell you about their damned involvement. These two saved my life when Endeavor was hellbent on beating me to death, Kirishima shouted angrily, his emotions being on the behalf of both himself and his saviors. Night Eye was completely unaffected by this, for he had gotten an answer. The black-haired teen had just told him that the other two were there that night, and that they were somehow involved. To him it was enough to say that they had fought Endeavor, which meant that they should be treated like real threats. Night Eye then pushed his glasses back into place, before speaking. Now there are two brats with an attitude. How terrific, the agent said, just as coldly as before. Both Kirishima and Bakugo got angry upon hearing this, as Night Eye then said, that attitude only strengthens my opinion about Endeavor's actions. With that attitude, I'm sure that he had a good reason for deciding to kill you. With a voice that, for the first time, showed any hint of aggression and malice. Kirishima just lost it after hearing these words, as he blindly charged in to fight Night Eye. He hardened his skin and began throwing wild punches towards the man, but none of them landed. Night Eye just kept avoiding every single attack like he could see it coming, until he countered. He pulled a weird object that looked like a paperweight out of his pocket, before using it to punch Kirishima in the face. The black-haired teen staggered backwards in pain, before charging in once more. Night Eye looked unaffected, as he knocked the teen back once again. The agent was about to follow up with another attack on the teen, but immediately stopped when Midoriya tried to attack him from behind. He dodged and knocked Midoriya back, before doing the same to the blonde that charged immediately after. Kirishima was stunned after seeing this, for he didn't know how it was possible. How was Night Eye capable of avoiding attacks that he clearly didn't see? The black-haired teen tried to answer this question, but stopped himself when seeing that Night Eye was about to charge at Midoriya. Kirishima didn't hesitate, as he dashed towards Night Eye and managed to knock him away from Midoriya. Kirishima was even more confused now. How did he manage to hit Night Eye just now? How does he do what he does? He pondered these questions deeply, until Bakugo walked up to his side and said, "This isn't working. We can't hit this bastard." With his usual level of aggression, Kirishima could feel the blonde's rising frustration, and he agreed with him. But he didn't have a solution to their problem, so he turned his attention towards Midoriya. The green-haired boy looked nervous, as always, but he was thinking. It looked like he was carefully going over everything that Night Eye had done up until now, and was actively looking for a way to turn the tide in their favor. That is when Midoriya's expression landed on the floodlight, and he got an idea. It's like he can see all of our moves before we do them, and that's terrifying. His vision is his greatest strength, but if we stop playing by his rules it can become his weakness. The green-haired boy then said, as he slowly stood himself up next to the other two teens. Both Bakugo and Kirishima looked at Midoriya in confusion, until the green-haired boy pointed towards the floodlight that was behind Night Eye. The other two teens finally understood what Midoriya was trying to say, and they liked the plan. They readied themselves, before charging in once more. Kirishima started by throwing a punch, which Night Eye smoothly avoided, then Bakugo readied one of his explosions. What first looked like an explosion meant to attack quickly turned into nothing but a blinding flash of light. Night Eye had no choice but to instinctively cover his eyes. But it was at that moment that he realized that his attention had been focused on the wrong person, because just a few meters away from Kirishima was Midoriya, looking ready to throw his knife. At first it looked like he was going to throw it at Night Eye, but that didn't happen. The green-haired boy threw his knife, which flew past Night Eye and crashed straight into the floodlight. The light broke, and the entire room was filled with darkness. Night Eye managed to recover his eyes a few seconds after the floodlight had been destroyed, and he could no longer see the vigilantes. He knew that they were still in the room, hiding in a dark corner or behind one of the many pillars, he just didn't know where. The room was almost completely dark, only faintly lit up by the little light that seeped in through the few windows. Midoriya, Bakugo, and Kirishima had been quick to run for cover after the light broke. The trio was hiding behind one of the pillars, breathing as silently as possible to make sure that Night Eye wouldn't find them. They had two options now. They could test their luck with fighting Night Eye like this, but that assumed that Night Eye was just as blind as they were. Or they could try and run away. But deep down they all knew that Night Eye wouldn't let that happen without a fight. This ultimately left them with only one option: take out Night Eye and then run away. You blinded me. Then you took out the only light source in the room so that I wouldn't see you anymore. Perhaps I ought to give you more credit than I initially did. But it won't be enough to defeat me, Night Eye then said, speaking loudly so that the vigilantes would hear him regardless of where they were. The trio were surprised to hear Night Eye speak, and they continued to listen as he said, "My quirk lets me see into the future. It lets me see every single decision and action that you're about to make. I'm sure that you know what this means." With the same voice as before, Midoriya, Bakugo, and Kirishima were all horrified upon hearing this. The fact that Night Eye could see into the future was something that they never would have imagined to be possible. Could they even win against something like that? "Why would he tell us this?" Kirishima whispered, his voice trembling from the utter terror that he was feeling. Bakugo breathed heavily as he realized why Night Eye had decided to tell them this information. Because he's already seen the outcome of this battle, he knows that he'll win. The blonde said, his voice almost being a perfect copy of Kirishima's. Midoriya was just as terrified as the other two, as his head went over Night Eye's words multiple times. He got more and more scared every time that he went over it, but that is when he realized something. Night Eye's words didn't align with his past actions, which meant that something else was going on. "No, that's not why he told us that. It's because he doesn't know the outcome. He's just trying to scare us," Midoriya then whispered, speaking his mind to the other teens. Bakugo and Kirishima looked at Midoriya confused, as he explained. "He claims that he's able to see all of our future moves, yet Kirishima was able to hit him. Not only that, but why didn't he stop us from destroying the floodlight if he knew that it was going to happen?" Midoriya whispered, calming himself down as he did. Bakugo and Kirishima were stunned, as they realized that Midoriya had a point. "I'm not saying that he was lying about his quirk, but maybe there's some sort of limit or requirement needed to activate it, because right now I believe that he can only use it on me and Bakugo, judging by the fact that only Kirishima has managed to land a hit," the green-haired boy then said. The other two were silently absorbing this theory until Bakugo added something. "Eye contact. When we were tied up he held our shoulders while locking eyes with us. Maybe that's how activates his quirk," the blonde said, sounding much calmer than he usually did. Midoriya looked at Bakugo before nodding in acceptance of this new theory. Kirishima, however, wasn't entirely sure. "How can you be so sure that he can't see my moves? Didn't you see how he avoided my initial flurry of attacks?" the black-haired teen said, being careful about the volume of his voice. Kirishima's worry was a valid one, but Bakugo was quick to shoot it down. "He wasn't using his quirk on you. He was just observing and predicting your moves. Even I could do that, especially if my opponent is a raging moron who attacks without thinking," the blonde said, this time sounding a little more aggressive. Kirishima was about to get angry about what Bakugo said, but stopped when he realized that it was true. Anyone could technically predict their opponent's moves. They just needed to be observant. This also meant that Night Eye was far more calculative than he first thought. He quickly realized that Kirishima was easily aggravated. Then he had chosen his words carefully to make him angry. This way he could make sure that Kirishima, the only person that he couldn't use his foresight on, was easy to read. Kirishima finished his thought as he turned to Midoriya and asked, "So what's the plan?" With a much calmer voice, Bakugo leaned in towards Midoriya because he wanted to hear this plan. The green-haired boy thought about it for a second, until he answered, "We hit and run. Attack him from different angles, hit him once, then flee into the darkness. Don't let him see a pattern. And since Kirishima isn't affected by his foresight, we need to make sure that he stays separated from me and Bakugo." Kirishima nodded in agreement to the plan, as Bakugo grinned and said, "I like it, let's kick his ass," sounding fired up, while still whispering. Midoriya only nodded towards the other two, before taking a deep breath and moving out. The trio took their positions around Night Eye, making sure to take different angles. The agent was standing in the darkness unaware of where the teens were, until someone suddenly charged from behind one of the pillars. Night Eye couldn't see who it was that had hit him, for they had backed off into hiding immediately after. Then came another hit, then another, then another. Each hit seemed to come from a different person, always from a different angle, and Night Eye was slowly being withered down with each one. The young vigilantes were not a group to be taken lightly, but there was a major flaw with their strategy. It looked to be random at first, but he managed to figure it out eventually. There was a pattern, and Night Eye now knew where the next attack was coming from. He stood himself up and patiently waited for the attack to come. Then it finally came from behind him, and Night Eye didn't waste any time. He turned to face the attacker, seeing that it was the one with green hair, and swung. Midoriya was caught off guard by Night Eye, and quickly dodged out of the way. The agent was surprised that the vigilante had managed to dodge, but he shrugged it off before throwing another kick. Midoriya had never been more focused in his entire life. He carefully watched Night Eye, and could then see and predict his moves. The green-haired boy actually managed to avoid Night Eye's hits, gaining a look of surprise from the AQTF agent. This didn't last, however, for the green-haired boy was unable to avoid more than just 4 hits. Night Eye grabbed Midoriya by the arm, holding him down with no hope of escaping. He then pulled out more of his ridiculously heavy paperweights, holding them between his fingers like a makeshift brass knuckle. Midoriya could see where this lethal attack was headed, and used his free arm to shield his head. Night Eye beat him over the arm twice, sending nasty cracks as the shock still went into Midoriya's skull. He then stopped aiming towards the head and proceeded to bombard the green-haired boy in the ribcage. Midoriya was overwhelmed with pain, as he could both feel and hear his ribs cracking and breaking apart. The pain was so great that he began to lose consciousness, but Night Eye still kept going with his mutilation. Midoriya, a voice then shouted furiously, before Night Eye was knocked away and into a wall. Midoriya fell to the ground, and through his now blurry vision, he could barely see that the person that had shouted was a furious Kirishima. The black-haired teen ran up to the staggered Night Eye and began to beat him down. He was enraged after seeing Midoriya almost get killed, and that fueled his flurry of attacks. Night Eye had been staggered and couldn't dodge, which made him a victim of Kirishima's wrath. The teen continued his beatdown, growing more violent and animalistic with each punch, even after his opponent stopped moving. But he was stopped from continuing any further when Bakugo pulled him away and shouted, "Stop it, you crook. You're killing him," with a voice that hinted at concern. Kirishima stopped as soon as he heard these words, and was horrified by what he had done. Night Eye's face had almost been beaten beyond recognition, bloody and broken. He was still breathing, but he still could have fooled people into thinking that he was dead. Kirishima was horrified by this. He hated the AQTF, but he never wished to kill any of them. But now he had done exactly what Endeavor had done to him, and he couldn't help but think that he was no better than that flaming bastard. Kirishima's shock was then broken by Bakugo, who ran over to the injured Midoriya. The black-haired teen was quick to join him, and tried to help the green-haired boy. "Are you all right?" Kirishima asked, looking very concerned by Midoriya's condition. The green-haired boy shivered and grunted in pain before he answered, "I think he broke some of my ribs," with a very strained voice. Both Bakugo and Kirishima looked more concerned upon hearing this, as the former then said, "We can't stay here. We have to go," with his usual aggressive tone. Kirishima only nodded in agreement to this, as he helped the blonde carry Midoriya away from the scene. Toshinori was getting anxious as he was worried. Neither Bakugo nor Midoriya had returned from their patrol yet, and it made him so anxious that he began walking in circles. "Can you stand still, Toshinori? You're making me dizzy," Aizawa said, sounding a little annoyed. Toshinori did not stop walking, as responded by saying, "How can I sit still? Midoriya and Bakugo are still out there. What if they got captured?" With a tone that was a mixture of worry and annoyance, Aizawa was about to speak against the buffed blonde, but was beaten to it by Stain, who said, "You worry too much, you blonde fool. Those brats aren't some kids in constant need of supervision. They're smart, strong, and dare I even say impressive." With a strong voice, Toshinori finally stopped walking back and forth as he stared at the red-clad vigilante. Stain looked back at the blonde man, grinning, as he then said, "I guarantee you this. At any moment now they're going to walk through that door, safe and sound, like nothing was wrong." With a determined voice, Aizawa was willing to speak up and make it a bet, but stopped himself when the door suddenly flung open to reveal three familiar figures. The adults stood up in shock, which quickly turned into worry when they saw the individuals in the doorway. "We need help here. Midoriya's injured," Bakugo shouted, prompting both Aizawa and Stain to run over and help carry Midoriya over to the table. While those two were helping Midoriya, Toshinori walked up and noticed that Kirishima had come in with the boys. "Young Kirishima?" the blonde man asked in confusion. The black-haired teen looked at the man, trying to hide his anxiety, as he said, "I encountered these two idiots while I was out for a stroll. They looked like they could use some help." With a voice that was trying to remain as calm as possible, Toshinori only smiled upon hearing this, relieved that Kirishima was able to find them. "What happened?" Aizawa then asked, sounding worried as both him and Stain helped Midoriya. "Some AQTF bastard called Night Eye tried to capture us," Bakugo then said, slowly returning to usual demeanor. Both Aizawa and Stain looked shocked upon hearing this, as they slowly looked over towards Toshinori. The teens noticed this and wondered what it was all about, but they didn't get to ask about it before Toshinori spoke. "Well, I'm glad that you're all okay. Have you found your friends yet?" the blonde man said, pointing the second half of his statement to Kirishima. The black-haired teen looked down into the ground, as he answered by saying, "Actually, I came looking for you regarding that matter. I need your help, and I," with an uncertain voice, but he stopped himself before he could finish. Toshinori was confused, as he waited for the teen to continue finishing his sentence. Kirishima continued looking down nervously, until he finally finished his sentence. "I want to join you," the teen finally said. Everyone in the room was shocked to hear this, for it was something that they hadn't expected. Kirishima tried to ignore their reactions, as he turned towards Midoriya. The green-haired boy had been bandaged up, and was now sitting on the table. "Last time we met you offered me to join you. Well, I've thought it over, and I think I'll take you up on that offer," Kirishima said, hoping that Midoriya hadn't forgotten what he said. The green-haired boy smiled upon hearing Kirishima's words, which in turn made him smile. These words made Toshinori smile once again, as he placed his hand on Kirishima's shoulder and said, Well, you won't hear any complaints from me. Welcome on board, young Kirishima. With his usual proud voice, Kirishima smiled more upon hearing this, as he saw both Stain and Aizawa nod with a hint of reluctance in their posture. The latter then walked over to his laptop and opened it up, only to be met with shocking news. This is a problem, Aizawa said tiredly. Everyone looked at him confused as he showed them all the news. It turns out that the events that had transpired earlier that night had been reported. The details about vigilante groups and the AQTF had been left out for the reason of not garnering too much attention. But the most concerning thing was the details of their suspect. The most outstanding details mentioned were those of a teenager with black hair. Everyone looked at it with mixed feelings. It wasn't much to go from, but it was still concerning since they knew that it was Kirishima that they were talking about. The room was silent for a moment, until Bakugo spoke up quite angrily. "You damned criminal. Do you not know how to keep a low profile?" The blonde shouted, showing his anger. Kirishima got annoyed upon hearing this, as he responded by saying, "That's rich coming from someone who can't speak without shouting." A little angrily, Bakugo got more angry upon hearing this, as he shouted, "What did you say? You damned crook." Which in turn led to Kirishima getting more angry and shouting back, "You heard me, you explosive idiot." The two continued like this for a while, until Stain was forced to get between them and stop them from fighting. Both Midoriya and Toshinori watched the exchange with weird expressions, as Midoriya asked, "What did I just witness?" with a tone that showed pure confusion. The one to answer him was Toshinori, who said, "Two teens in desperate need of anger management, or a game of tennis, but instead of a ball they're throwing angry insults at each other. Or maybe both." With an equally confused voice, Midoriya giggled upon hearing Toshinori's words, which in turn led to the blonde also giggling. "Regardless if they need anger management or not, we need to solve the issue of Kirishima having black hair. I think the easiest way to do that is with a mask," Aizawa then said, sounding just as tired as before. Aizawa began to discuss the matter with the others, until Midoriya spoke up after thinking. "I have a suggestion. Why don't we just change his hairstyle and hair color?" The green-haired boy said, voice still a little strained from his injuries. Everyone looked at him in silence, as they realized that it was probably one of the easier solutions to their problem. Kirishima thought about it for a second, until he said, "I like that idea." With a grin, back in the abandoned building, Night Eye still lied beaten and battered. He just woke up from his unconscious state, and he was baffled by what had happened. He had been defeated by a group of teenagers, and some of them even had anger issues. He couldn't help but think that all three of them had potential, especially the one with green hair. He realized the benefits of destroying the floodlights. He probably figured him out and built a strategy, and he was able to predict and avoid some of his attacks. He would have made a great agent of the AQTF, which is why it's a loss to see him on the side of vigilantism. But despite that heavy loss, Night Eye still has won. He primarily came here for information, and he got his hands on a crucial piece. The agent struggled to properly breathe, as he gave words to the information that he had obtained. Midoriya, outro. Thank you all for sticking around, and I hope that you enjoyed. Before you leave, we would just like to let you know that We the Celestials has many other channels for your entertainment and viewing purposes. All the information you'll need is right below here in the description, so feel free to check out all the other incredible projects our team creates. Secondly, on behalf of We the Celestials, I'd like to thank everyone involved in the production of today's awesome content. Their details will be in the description below. That's all for today's video, so goodbye and have a divine day. Hey, what is up, mortals? Welcome to Season 6 Part 1 What If Quirks Were Outlawed? I just wanted to greet you guys by just saying, sit back and relax, you're in for a treat. So, we begin. After the incident with Night Eye, the vigilantes took it slowly for a while. There are two reasons for this. Number one was that the AQTF were more active than ever before. The defeat of Night Eye had hit them hard, especially since it was just after Endeavor was defeated. The media were still kept in the dark about the vigilantes, and Midoriya was starting to wonder why. The second reason for them slowing down was that Midoriya needed to recover after his beatdown. Night Eye had left him battered, but everyone knew that the green-haired boy would only grow stronger thanks to this. The issue, however, was with both Kirishima and Bakugo. The adults refused to let the teens patrol unless they were in groups of two, and that was the issue. Bakugo and Kirishima were like fire and ice. They simply didn't get along with each other. Their incompatibility meant that they couldn't be placed in the same patrol group, which meant that they needed to patrol with one of the adults. This also meant that they couldn't cover as much ground, so they couldn't properly patrol until Midoriya had recovered. It took some time, but Midoriya was eventually back in a close-to-peak condition. He hadn't just recovered either. The other vigilantes noticed a change. He had little more confidence, and it looked like he had been practicing something new. They didn't question it, however, and quickly returned to patrolling. Midoriya was grouped up with Kirishima, and they set out to try and find the latter's friends. Kirishima was worried about being recognized at first, But that worry quickly vanished after his first patrol. The teen had taken Midoriya's advice and changed both his hair color and style. He now had spiky hair that almost resembled Bakugo's, and it was a dark red instead of its usual black. His costume consisted of an open black vest, with a dark red and short-sleeved undershirt. To cover the bottom part of his face, he had a scarf wrapped around his neck so that it covered both his mouth and nose. The two vigilantes carefully made their way through the dark streets, keeping their eyes and ears up for any criminal activity, or the AQTF for that matter. They were patrolling the parts that Kirishima thought his friends were most likely in, but they weren't having any form of luck. They had searched almost every place that Kirishima could think of, but their lack of results could also be a result of the fact that Midoriya didn't really know what to look for. You know, this would be much easier if you told me the names, quirks, and appearances of the people we're looking for, Midoriya stated, his voice being relatively calm through his worry. Kirishima thought about it for a second, until he mentally facepalmed when realizing that Midoriya was right. You're right. We're looking for 3 people, 2 girls and 1 boy. The boy is called Mashiro Ajiro. He's blonde and his quirk is a mutation type that gives him a tail. The girls are called Mina Ashido and Ochako Uraraka. The former has pink skin and horns, and her quirk lets her secrete a type of acid. The latter has short brown hair with brown eyes, and her quirk lets her remove gravity from any object she touches. The now red-haired teen said, properly explaining the appearance and quirks of the people they're looking for. Midoriya was intrigued by the trio's quirks, for he found them interesting in many ways. But one thought that passed through his mind made him rather sour. So what you're trying to say is that we couldn't miss them even if we tried. And that gives me 3 possible explanations for us still being empty-handed. The first being that we simply are worthless when it comes to searching, which is totally possible. The second being that they are incredibly good at hiding, in which case we don't have to worry about them getting arrested by the AQTF. Or, the green-haired boy carefully explained, until he stopped himself before talking about the third possibility. Kirishima stopped to look at Midoriya, for he could almost predict what the green-haired boy was about to say. Midoriya observed Kirishima's reaction as he finished his explanation. The third possibility is that we aren't looking in the right places, in which case we might never find them. But the simple fact that we haven't been there yet tells me something critical. You don't want us to go there, the green-haired boy said, sounding like he was interrogating the red-haired boy. Kirishima shivered and looked a little scared upon hearing this, which was enough evidence to say that Midoriya had been correct with his statement. The green-haired boy knew that he was right, but he was worried. If Kirishima was this scared by just thinking of it, what kind of place could it be? What are you hiding? Midoriya asked more kindly, hoping that Kirishima would open up to his words. The red-haired teen looked uncertain about what to say, like he would rather just forget what he knew and never rediscover it. He then clenched his fist, as he realized that he needed to talk about it. There's a place that I haven't shown you yet, one that is hidden from the outside. But we're better off never going there, for it can only be explained as hell, Kirishima said, sounding like he was afraid. Midoriya wanted to ask a follow-up question, but the red-haired teen answered it before he could ask. It's what one would call an underground fight club, a place where you can fight with your quirk and there are almost no rules. It's a haven of crime where the worst kind of people gather to do their shady business. But the worst is the people running it, Kirishima said, still sounding terrified. Midoriya was very concerned for Kirishima, but he still needed to know what they might be dealing with. What makes them so bad? The green-haired boy asked, still trying to remain calm. Kirishima took another breath, steadying himself, before giving an answer. It's run by a Yakuza. That alone is terrifying, but this group is worse. They're called the Shai Hasekai, with a man named Overhaul as their leader. They have incredibly powerful members with different types of quirks, but Overhaul takes the cake in that category. His quirk gives full control over whatever matter he touches. He can kill you with just the touch of a single finger, the red-haired boy said, now sounding more terrified than ever before. Midoriya was both shocked and scared upon hearing this. The fact that this fight club was run by the Yakuza was terrifying enough, but for that same Yakuza to have so much power was just pure insanity. He didn't want to believe that the people they were looking for could be there, but the fact remained that it was a possibility. The way that Kirishima spoke made him imagine that he and his friends had been there before, and that it wasn't such a pleasant experience. That alone was enough for Midoriya to say that they shouldn't go there. But that voice was overpowered by the idea of Kirishima's friends being there and being in trouble. The green-haired boy looked at his red-haired companion, giving him a stern look, as he said, "You're not going to like this, but we can't leave that stone unturned." With a voice that tried to be as calm as possible, Kirishima's expression changed into a mixture of shock and anger as Midoriya continued by saying, "I'm not saying that we need to go in there without being absolutely certain, but right now it seems that they aren't anywhere on Earth, which means that they are either in heaven or," but was cut off by Kirishima, who finished his sentence by saying, "Hell," with a distraught voice. Midoriya could feel how conflicted Kirishima was. On one hand, he wanted to find his friends. On the other, he didn't want to be anywhere near that place. The red-haired teen clenched his fist before taking a deep breath and saying, "Fine, but if we encounter Overhaul, you need to promise me that you won't let him touch you under any circumstances, not even for a handshake." With a somewhat angry tone. Midoriya was shocked to hear this tone, but he understood immediately. Overhaul could control matter, so shaking hands could result in dying before you even knew what was going on. The green-haired boy shook his head in response to his companion, without uttering a single word. Kirishima still looked a little angry, or maybe uneasy, as started walking while saying, "Follow me." Midoriya didn't wait for a second before following slightly behind Kirishima. The duo maneuvered themselves through different parts of the city until they eventually came to a stop. The place they were looking for had its entrance in a secluded alleyway, one that no one would guess actually led to a fight club. Not a single sound was emitted from the normal-looking entrance door, and not a single trace could be seen of anything else. Occasionally they would see someone enter through, but there wasn't anything else that suggested any form of activity. Therefore this place might as well not exist to Midoriya. But Kirishima couldn't stress enough that behind that door was the place that he remembered as hell. The two vigilantes observed the seemingly unguarded entrance from a rooftop, the only place that Kirishima felt comfortable observing it from. They were waiting for a sign, anything that would tell them what they needed to know. Midoriya was waiting patiently, and looked like he could stay there for a while with no problem. Kirishima, however, wasn't handling it very well. The red-haired teen looked ready to leave at any moment. He didn't even want to be here in the first place. "I've got a bad feeling about this. Can we leave now?" Kirishima whisper shouted, sounding a little angry as he did. Midoriya could tell that his companion was hiding his fear behind that anger, but it didn't stop him from watching the door. "I'm not leaving until I'm sure," Midoriya said, sounding as calm as the wind. Kirishima couldn't understand how his companion managed to remain so calm, but he ultimately took it as ignorance of the danger that they were in. "All right, I'm gonna go and be safe. You can stay here and be sorry," the red-haired teen said, finally having enough of what they were doing. Midoriya was about to say something that would hopefully calm and convince Kirishima to stay, but he was interrupted by something he saw. The green-haired boy could see that someone else was about to enter through the door to hell. The figure was wearing a cloak that covered most of its body, but there was a part that it could never hope to cover up. Midoriya almost smiled upon seeing this, as he looked towards Kirishima and said, "I don't think that you want to leave just yet. Someone with a blonde tail is about to enter." With a relatively calm voice, Kirishima shook upon hearing this, as he quickly snapped his gaze towards the entrance. He only managed to get a glimpse of the figure, but it was more than enough for him. Kirishima looked wide-eyed, as he slowly turned towards Midoriya and said, "That's him, that's Ojiro," with a worried tone. Midoriya could understand Kirishima's worry, for one of his friends had just walked into the place that they shouldn't be at. "What's the odds of someone else having the exact same tail as Ojiro?" Midoriya then asked, hoping to make sure that it really was Ojiro that they saw. Kirishima shivered a little as he answered, "Pretty damn low," with a half-trembling voice. Midoriya thought that this was the case, as he then asked, "So if that's Ojiro who just went in, what's the odds of the other two being in there already?" Kirishima thought about this for a second, until he reached an answer that he didn't want in the slightest. "Pretty damn high," the red-haired teen answered reluctantly, not wanting to believe what just came out of his own mouth. Kirishima knew what came next. Who wouldn't? If they wanted to not only retrieve his friends but also save them, he needed to go down there and get them. But anything could happen down there, and no one stops anyone from doing it. If they go down there, they might never come back. But if they don't, they might never save his friends. "It's your call. I can't make the decision to go down there since I barely know what we're dealing with. I won't go down there on my own, but at the same time I won't force you to go with me. So you decide on what we do," Midoriya then said, knocking Kirishima out of his thoughts. The red-haired teen was surprised by this, but he didn't let it show. He wanted to say that they needed to leave, but he couldn't. It wasn't just that his friends were down there, it was that he felt pathetic. Midoriya had saved him from endeavor, and he did it without second-guessing. If he didn't stand up and get through this now, he would be insulting Midoriya, and he wouldn't deserve to stand by his side. Kirishima clenched his fist hard, steeling his nerves as he settled on what to do. "All right, then we're not leaving without them," the redhead said, sounding just as angry as he was determined. Midoriya smiled after seeing this result from his companion, before he said, "Lead the way," while pointing towards the door that they knew as the gate to hell. Getting into hell was much easier than Midoriya had expected. Turns out that Kirishima knew exactly how to get in with a minimum amount of problems. Before entering, they made a precaution to always wear their masks, so that the wrong person wouldn't know their faces. Upon entering through the door, the teens were met with a staircase that led underground. They took the steps downwards, noticing how the halls twisted at certain occasions, until they finally made it all the way down. Upon reaching the bottom, they were met by an environment that matched Kirishima's description. A massive arena-like room that was packed full with spectators surrounding a caged ring in the middle. Midoriya took a good look around and could see criminals of different shapes and sizes, which scared him to a certain extent. But he managed to push that fear away, for he had a mission. We need to stick together. We're as good as doomed if we get separated. Let's find them and get out quickly, Kirishima then said, his voice barely audible through the shouts and bellows. Midoriya agreed with his companion, as they both forced their way through the tough crowd. Searching was not easy with this many people. It could take all day, and the longer they stayed, the more danger they were in. Midoriya searched the area with his eyes until he noticed some strange figures. Their body structures were normal, but it was their faces that Midoriya was wondering about. These figures wore some sort of bird-like masks, and they looked like they were guarding some secluded area of the club. The green-haired boy wondered who these figures were, until he remembered what Kirishima had told him earlier. The redhead had told him that Overhaul and his men all wore these types of masks, which meant that these figures were with the Shy Hasekai. Midoriya's gaze observed the room that they were guarding. It had a massive glass window so that one could see through it, and its decorations only said that this was the VIP room. The green-haired boy was about to keep analyzing the crowd, until something caught his attention in the VIP room. That attention, however, quickly turned into horror when he finally realized what he was seeing. "Hey, is that the VIP room?" Midoriya asked, standing still and voice trembling slightly. Kirishima looked towards the room as he answered, "Sort of. Overhaul always sits there, watching over the matches like a damned hawk," the redhead said, trying to make his voice heard. Midoriya shivered upon hearing this, for things were much worse than they appeared to be. "Then things are a lot worse than I initially thought. Look what's inside the VIP room," Midoriya then said, sounding like things had escalated for the worse. Kirishima was confused upon hearing this tone of voice, but that confusion quickly turned into horror once he saw what Midoriya meant. Standing next to Overhaul were two teenage girls, and he recognized them both. They were Mina Ashido and Ochako Uraraka, but he still couldn't see Ajiro. The redhead was about to ask about it, but was interrupted by an announcement within the ring. Both vigilantes turned their attention towards the ring, and noticed that they were announcing a new fight. On one side was a huge man named Kendo Rappa, who apparently was Overhaul's strongest fighter, and on the other side was the third person that they were looking for. On the other side of the ring was none other than Mashirao Ajiro, and he looked ready to fight. A silence filled the air, and the ring stood completely still. Then the starting bell was sounded, which would ironically be the ending bell too. Rappa had thrown his punch right as the bell sounded, and it was at an incredible speed. Ajiro stood no chance, and was knocked out immediately. Both Midoriya and Kirishima were shocked to see this, but one of them shouldn't have been. Midoriya then quickly switched gears, as he turned towards Kirishima and said, "We need to do something now. I don't care how we do it, but we need to get in there." With a voice that sounded a little angry, as he pointed towards the VIP room, Kirishima only agreed to this, and told Midoriya that he had a plan. The two of them walked up the entrance of the VIP room, before they started to attack and beat the guards. They managed to get a few hits in, but then they were overwhelmed and dragged into the room. Upon entry, they were thrown to the floor with quite a lot of force, which made them both grunt in pain. "There, we're in," Kirishima said, grunting through his newfound pain. Midoriya got a little annoyed, as he responded by saying, "Yeah, but that doesn't justify your idiotic plan," while also grunting a little. "What has the cat dragged in now?" a cold and terrifying voice said. Both teens looked towards the speaker and saw that it was none other than Overhaul. He was sitting in a chair, and he looked slightly annoyed. Midoriya was going to say something, but he was interrupted by another voice. "Kirishima," it said. They both turned their gazes towards its source and saw that it was a surprised Ashido. "Yeah, can we save it until after we get out of here?" Kirishima responded, which confirmed the pink-skinned girl's suspicion. Ashido nodded in understanding, as she stood close to the quiet Uraraka. "What makes you think that you can leave?" Overhaul then asked, sounding more ominous than before. Kirishima and the girls were all dead silent in response to this horrifying presence. But the person who spoke up was Midoriya. "Because we said that we were going to do so," the green-haired boy said, earning a shocked expression from the others. Overhaul was surprised that the green-haired boy had the guts to speak up, but that surprise was quickly replaced by curiosity. The Yakuza leader carefully observed Midoriya until he spoke. "Are you perhaps one of those vigilantes? The one that defeated Endeavor?" Overhaul said, his voice sounding just as ominous as before. Midoriya was shocked and wondered how Overhaul knew about that, but then realized that he probably had a lot of connections. The green-haired boy didn't answer that question and remained silent. Overhaul made almost no reaction, taking Midoriya's silent reaction as a yes. He was impressed by this, and it made him think of an idea. "You're impressive, so I have a proposition for you. I'll arrange a fight between you and a fighter of my choosing. If you win, you and your friends may go scot-free." Overhaul said, his voice still being ominous. Midoriya was a little intrigued, but he was also afraid. And if I lose? The green-haired boy asked, trying to remain as calm as possible. Overhaul didn't change his expression as he answered by saying, then you and your friends will start working for me. Also, need I remind you that your other option is to die right here and now. Now it wasn't just Midoriya that was terrified. Kirishima, Ashido, and Uraraka were equally scared. Midoriya needed to win. If he didn't, they would either be enslaved or dead. Silence filled the room, until Kirishima spoke up. Let me fight then. The redhead almost shouted, pushing away his terror. Overhaul was unaffected by this, as he responded by saying, no, I specifically asked for him. He defeated Endeavor, so I believe that he is more qualified to do this. With the same cold voice as before, Kirishima hanged his head in shame, for it was partially true. Midoriya had defeated Endeavor, and he even managed to fight and outmaneuver Night Eye. If any one of them was qualified to do this, it was him. Don't worry, I don't plan on losing, Midoriya then said, his voice trying to be reassuring. Kirishima looked at his green-haired friend, noticing his smile, before he calmed down and nodded. Midoriya then looked towards Overhaul, expression looking stern, as he said, I'll do it, with determination behind his voice. Overhaul was as cold as ever, but one could sense the hint of a smile behind his mask. But that quickly vanished, as he looked serious and said, very well, what do I call you? With a voice that wasn't nearly as ominous as before. Midoriya looked a little confused upon hearing this, but he didn't get to say anything before Kirishima answered for him. Dekaru, his name is Dekaru, the redhead said, almost sounding proud. Midoriya looked at him in confusion, which prompted Kirishima to explain himself. What? I believe that you can do it, the redhead shouted, trying to fire the green-haired boy up. Midoriya was almost a little weirded out, but that quickly vanished when an unknown voice spoke up. Please win, Dekaru, the fragile voice said, which turned out to be a teary Uraraka. Midoriya was shocked to see this, but it only served to make him more determined to win. The green-haired boy then looked at Overhaul, who stood up from his seat and said, all right then, you've chosen your name and you're motivated. Now I'll tell you who your opponent is. With his usual ominous voice, Midoriya was unshaken, for he didn't care who his opponent was. Overhaul slowly walked up to the green-haired boy, looking ready to pull the rug from underneath him as he finished his sentence. You'll be facing my strongest fighter, Kendo Rappa. Outro. Thank you all for sticking around, and I hope that you enjoyed. Before you leave, we would just like to let you know that We The Celestials has many other channels for your entertainment and viewing purposes. All the information you'll need is right below here in the description, so feel free to check out all the other incredible projects our team creates. Secondly, on behalf of We The Celestials, I'd like to thank everyone involved in the production of today's awesome content. Their details will be in the description below. That's all for today's video, so goodbye and have a divine day. Hey, what is up, mortals? Welcome Season 1 Part 7 of What If Quirks Were Outlawed. I just wanted to greet you guys by just saying, sit back and relax, you're in for a treat. So, we begin. Toshinori was out doing his usual patrol, on the lookout for any suspicious activity. Usually he would be with Bakugo these days, but the Ashen Blonde was currently under the care of Stain. This left Toshinori on his own to both patrol and worry for the young vigilantes he had taken in. Midoriya and Kirishima would be patrolling together without supervision, and he couldn't help but have a bad feeling in his gut. He ultimately shrugged it off, however, for even Stain had been impressed with the teens. If that said anything, it meant that they are more than capable of handling themselves. The feats that the teens had done so far were so impressive to Toshinori that he couldn't stop thinking about it. He was running low on time, and he needs to find someone to carry on his legacy. The blonde was confident that this someone would be one of the young vigilantes, and he already had his sights locked onto one of them specifically. Toshinori continued his train of thought while walking down the streets, until a cry for help broke him out of it. The blonde man didn't stop to think. He just ran into the alleyway that it came from. He ran at top speed so that he would get there in time, but he was confused when arriving where he thought that the scream had originated. There was no one there. There wasn't even a trace of human activity. Toshinori wondered what was going on, and even started to believe that he had imagined the cry for help. His questions were quickly answered, however, when the presence of an ominous figure made itself known in the alley. Toshinori didn't need to turn around to know who this was, for his presence alone had been etched into his soul. But the blonde still turned around, filled with both shock and rage as he met eyes with the man that was before him. He looked like an ordinary man, but his aura said otherwise. He wore a suit, and a certain engraving on said suit made it clear that this man was with the AQTF. He looked at Toshinori without saying a single word, because no words were needed. The situation had been made clear the second that the figure decided to make himself known. This battle is kill or be killed. The club was packed to the brim with people of various origins, shapes, and sizes, all surrounding the caged ring in the center. Within the cage were two figures, and they could be described as polar opposites. On one end was a tall and muscular man with long light brown hair, and a plague mask. This was none other than the #1 fighter in this domain, Kendo Rappa. On the other side was a much shorter boy with a green appearance and a metallic mask covering the lower part of his face. This was none other than the vigilante responsible for the defeat of both Endeavor and Sir Night-Eye. His name was Izuku Midoriya, but all except for one in this domain knew him by the name of Dekoru. The two fighters stared at each other, one being more skeptical than the other. Meanwhile, in the club's VIP room were 5 individuals. These were Kirishima, Anjiro, Ashido, Uraraka, and Overhaul, observing as the match was being announced. Anjiro had just been brought there after his defeat and was quickly filled in on the situation, but only served to make him uncertain. "Are you sure that this guy can do it? Rappa is almost twice his size," Anjiro exclaimed quite angrily towards his now red-haired friend. Kirishima was about to answer him, but he was beaten to it by none other than Overhaul. "Size isn't everything. The fact that he defeated Endeavor is proof of that. My question is how he plans on winning. Does he perhaps have a strong quirk?" the masked man said, sounding just as cold as always. Everyone was silent after hearing this, for they almost had no hope. It was bad enough that they had to rely on someone they didn't know, but they didn't know what quirk this person had. It was almost best to just give up immediately, but Kirishima didn't think that way. He knew the disadvantage that Midoriya was in. He knew that it might as well be impossible to win, but he still believed. The green-haired boy hadn't just saved him from Endeavor, he defeated Night-Eye by outsmarting him. He knew that it would be hard, but he still had hope for Midoriya's victory. "Listen to me now, because I will only say this once. The only person that will walk out of that ring victorious is Dekoru," Kirishima then said, sounding like he was trying to convince himself as much as the others. The other teens looked at him quite shocked, before deciding to believe in Kirishima's judgment. Overhaul looked unamused as usual, before responding by saying, "We'll see about that." Tension was rising in the air, and the fighters were getting ready. The match had been fully announced, both contenders introduced. Now they just waited for the bell to sound. Midoriya looked calm, but he was actually very nervous. He was carrying a lot on his shoulders right now, the lives of himself and 4 other people. He didn't know if he was ready, if he actually had the power to pull this off. "Hey, kid," a gruff voice said, knocking Midoriya out of his thoughts. The green-haired boy looked to see that it was Rappa, who looked at him while saying, "The boss claims that you're special, is that true?" With what seemed to be his usual voice. Midoriya was still nervous, and he didn't know what to say. Rappa must have been talking about how he defeated Endeavor, but Midoriya wasn't alone that night. In almost every fight he's been through so far he had help from a stronger individual, but that wasn't the case now. He's alone now, and there is nothing about him that is special. Midoriya clenched his fist in frustration, hating how weak he was, until he stopped when he remembered the words that Kirishima had said to him just minutes before now. The redhead believed in him, somehow, so maybe it was time for him to start believing in himself for once. The green-haired vigilante shed his shell of nervousness, donning a new one of confidence, before answering Rappa's question. "You'll just have to wait and see for yourself," he said, not a single ounce of nervousness left in his body. Rappa was surprised by this response, before grinning with excitement as he walked to his side of the ring. Both fighters now stood a fair distance away from each other, both having taken their stances. They stood silent and stared at the other, preparing themselves for what's to come. Then, as the tension was at its highest, the bell sounded. Rappa wasted no time, and immediately threw the first punch towards the vigilante. His fist ripped and tore through the air, bellowing as it approached at terrifying speeds. Then a loud bang was heard, leaving everyone stunned and silent. Rappa's fist was now still, having been fully extended. At the end of it, everyone expected to find a broken vigilante, but they didn't. Rappa's fist had missed its target. It hadn't collided with anything. Just half a meter to the side of his fist stood the vigilante, completely unharmed. Rappa was infamous for being completely undefeated, but there was something else that made him even more terrifying. In every match that he's fought so far, he has won with one single punch. He always launched the first one, he always landed it, and it always defeated his opponent, until today. Everyone looked at the vigilante in shock and astonishment, almost not wanting to believe what he just did. It wasn't that Rappa had missed his target, it was something else. No way. He avoided the first strike. Ajiro shouted in disbelief, not believing his eyes for a second. Even Overhaul was shocked by this, because he noticed something odd about Rappa's fist. It was way slower than he remembered it to be. Rappa was surprised to see this result, but it didn't stop him from attacking. The brawler took the offensive and began throwing punch after punch relentlessly. Midoriya, on the other hand, was somehow avoiding all of them. The volley of strikes kept flying, with the young vigilante remaining untouched. Eventually, Rappa staggered from losing his balance, and Midoriya took advantage of it. The vigilante closed the gap between himself and the brawler, before delivering an elbow strike to his nose. A loud crack could be heard, and the audience looked even more shocked, as Rappa staggered backwards while covering his nose. Overhaul was even more shocked now, as he witnessed the scene while saying, "That kid, he drew first blood." sounding just as shocked as he looked. Midoriya stood tall in front of his opponent, readying to both attack and defend. But that was when Rappa gave him a weird look. He was smiling. The brawler, even though he was painfully clutching his bleeding nose, was smiling with joy. He looked at Midoriya before saying, "I felt that. I actually felt that. That attack actually got to me." His voice sounded both happy and shocked. Midoriya was confused upon hearing this, until he saw Rappa blow some blood out of his nose before taking a stance and saying, "Kid, you're awesome," with even more joy and excitement, as he charged in for another flurry of attacks. The battle continued like this. Rappa kept throwing a never-ending barrage of attacks and Midoriya kept avoiding all of them, while landing his own hits in Rappa's weak spots. The observers in the VIP room were all in awe as they witnessed the small vigilante slowly, but certainly, whittle down the giant brawler in front of him. "He's fast," Ashido said in awe, reflecting what she was seeing in the ring. "No, he's not fast, Rappa's slow," Overhaul answered, having returned to his usual cold self. Everyone turned to the masked man, as he began to explain. "It looks like Rappa's fist isn't moving at its usual speed. It's almost like his quirk has been tampered with," the masked man said. Everyone was shocked upon hearing this, especially Kirishima. Midoriya was quirkless if he remembered correctly, so he shouldn't be able to cancel Rappa's quirk. This could only mean one thing: someone else in the crowd was interfering with the fight. Kirishima smiled upon realizing this, for this meant that Midoriya actually had a chance to win. The redhead then turned his attention towards his friends, seeing that both Ashido and Uraraka were cheering for Midoriya. Ajiro, however, looked concerned. "Is something wrong, Ajiro?" the redhead asked, wondering what was bothering his blonde friend. Ajiro looked at Kirishima with concerned eyes, before saying, "He's fighting like an amateur. He's wasting so much of his stamina with those wasteful movements of his," with a tone that almost sounded angry. Kirishima didn't expect this from Ajiro, so he took a closer look at Midoriya. What he found made him just as concerned as his blonde friend. Midoriya was avoiding Rappa's attacks, but it was far from perfect. Every time he dodges, he moves in a wasteful way, which in turn makes him lose an unnecessary amount of stamina. At this rate, he might wear himself out before Rappa hits the ground. The battle raged on, and one could clearly see the effects of damage and exhaustion on both fighters. Midoriya was starting to slow down due to his stamina almost being depleted, but Rappa had been whittled so much that he was in the same condition as Midoriya. They were nearing their limits, but they refused to give up for their own different reasons. Rappa threw another punch, barely missing the vigilante. Midoriya took this opportunity to close in and deliver another devastating blow. He got closer to Rappa and then, with all of his might, landed a blow to the brawler's liver. Rappa staggered from the pain, looking like he was ready to collapse. Midoriya believed that his victory was certain, for a hit to the liver can bring anyone to their knees. Unfortunately, he made the mistake of underestimating Rappa. The green-haired boy lowered his guard as the brawler landed on his knees. But this was a mistake. Out of nowhere, a powerful blow was thrown towards Midoriya's right side. The vigilante barely had any time to react, and could only defend by shielding himself with his right arm. A loud crack could be heard, and the green-haired vigilante was thrown into one of the cage walls. Ajiro's worry had come true. Midoriya had wasted so much of his stamina that he couldn't avoid that attack. Not only that, but the mysterious power that had been suppressing Rappa's quirk until now had lost its effect. The vigilante pulled himself back up from the cage wall, grunting in pain as he did. His right arm was broken, which left him with yet another setback. Rappa was also struggling to stand, having been whittled down severely. Both fighters were in bad condition, which meant that one thing was certain: this battle was beginning to reach its conclusion. Rappa entered a berserking rage as he charged and threw another punch at Midoriya. The vigilante barely dodged it, noticing how Rappa had slowed down again. He bit through the pain as he delivered another hit to Rappa's nose. The brawler was forced to stagger in pain, blinding himself as he instinctively reached for his face. But he forced it away and readied himself to throw another punch at Midoriya, who had disappeared. Rappa was confused, for it looked like his opponent had vanished into thin air. His confusion was answered, however, when he felt something jump onto his back and wrap itself around his neck and body. It didn't take long for him to realize that this was the vigilante, sneaking up behind him and grabbing him in a rear-naked chokehold. The observers in the VIP room were once again stunned. Midoriya had blinded Rappa by hitting him in the nose. Then he snuck up behind him and caught him by surprise in a chokehold. This was something that surprised Kirishima, for he had never seen Midoriya use grappling before. It made him realize just how hard Midoriya actually works. Rappa tried to break free from Midoriya's hold, but quickly found out that the vigilante wouldn't let go unless he was dead. So he instead ran backwards and rammed his back into one of the cage walls, slamming Midoriya as he did. The green-haired boy coughed blood and was overwhelmed with pain, as Rappa repeatedly slammed him into the cage wall, but he still refused to let go. He couldn't lose. Too many people depended on him right now. Rappa didn't stop his brutal pounding on Midoriya as he slowly felt himself lose his strength. He didn't get it. How was this kid so strong? He might be able to suppress quirks, but that shouldn't be enough. He even managed to draw first blood. So where did he find such incredible power? Rappa tried to answer these questions, but could only reach one possible answer in the end. This kid wasn't ready to die just yet. He had something that he needed to do, a place where he needed to be, and something that he needed to become. The weight that this true warrior carries is beyond anything he could have imagined, and it only served to fill him with more joy. The brawler smiled through his mask, right before the unexpected happened once more. Right as Midoriya looked ready to let go, Rappa fell to his knees. His body was limp as he crashed into the ground with the vigilante still tied onto his back. The entire arena was still and silent, for they hadn't expected this outcome. But they all burst out in cheers and bellows as the green vigilante sat himself up and raised his hand to the heavens. Everyone was livid, cheering for the new king of the ring. But none of them were cheering as much as the teens in the VIP room. Ashido and Uraraka had tears in their eyes as they cried out in joy. Ajiro was so shocked that he couldn't react, and Kirishima reacted in a similar fashion to the girls. Another person that was shocked was Overhaul. He was expecting Midoriya to lose, but he ended up winning. The masked man had no choice but to honor their deal, with newfound respect towards the man called Dekoru. After the fight, both Rappa and Midoriya were given medical treatment. Shortly after that, Midoriya along with the other teens were brought in front of Overhaul, who sat in his chair looking as cold as always. Midoriya could barely stand on his own due to his injuries, so he leaned onto both Kirishima and Ajiro as he looked towards Overhaul and said, "I won the match, we had a deal." With a strained voice, Overhaul looked untouched by this as he sighed before saying, "Yes, you are free to go. Before you leave, however, there's something about you that's been bugging me all this time. Why did you choose to become a vigilante, when you of all people should benefit from this society?" With his usual cold voice, Midoriya didn't expect to hear this question, but he should have. This might as well be $1 million question, and he could tell that Kirishima and the others also wanted to know the answer. Midoriya looked at the mask-wearing Yakuza before giving him his answer. "That's a simple question, so I'll give you a simple answer. I did it because I decided to do the right thing," the green-haired vigilante said, sounding calm despite being injured. Overhaul didn't expect to hear this answer, so he prompted Midoriya to continue. "I don't think it's right for those with quirks to be mistreated and have to live in fear. I became a vigilante to help people, and because I believe that society is wrong in how they view and treat quirks," Midoriya said, sounding just as calm as he did before. Overhaul was once again surprised, but he quickly returned to his usual self before saying, "I believe that most of society would agree when I say that quirks are a disease." With his usual cold voice, Midoriya was a little affected by this, but it wasn't enough to discourage him. "Then most of society is wrong." Cavemen probably reacted similarly to tools and fire before realizing the benefits that came with using them, the vigilante said, just as unfazed as he was before. Overhaul was outright shocked by now. This vigilante truly wants to change society, and he even believes in quirks. The mask-wearing Yakuza almost felt defeated as he leaned over in his chair and said, "You're an odd one, Dekoru." With a quiet voice, Midoriya couldn't help giving a gentle smile at this, and he could sense that the other teens were smiling with him. But that was quickly ruined when the sound of a loud bang, followed by something similar to the marching of soldiers, filled the room. Overhaul stood up from his seat as everyone looked outside, only to find out what was happening. "The AQTF, they found us," the Yakuza leader shouted, as his men started to move out and fight back. Overhaul looked towards the teens, almost looking a little annoyed, before shouting, "You need to get out of here, now." The teens didn't waste a second and started to move out, almost carrying Midoriya as they did. They didn't get far, however, before they were stopped by a muscular figure. It was Rappa, and he looked serious. The group expected Rappa to try and stop them, but were surprised when he said, "Follow me," before walking through a door. The teens were confused, but they didn't question it too much as they followed the brawler with haste. The room they had been led to looked to be some kind of storage with multiple crates along the walls. The teens didn't get to analyze it too much before Rappa proceeded to barricade the door with one of the crates. He then walked over to the other end of the room to move another crate and reveal what looked to be a secret door in the ground. The boss had many of these made in case of an emergency, like this one. "It'll lead you to an alleyway far away from here. Use this to get away," Rappa said, the serious tone in his voice never disappearing. Midoriya and the other teens were all confused by this, so he decided to ask, "Why are you helping us? Aren't you angry that you lost?" With a voice that perfectly reflected his confusion, Rappa looked at him with a dead serious glare before saying, "You defeated me fair and square, no hard feelings," and, with a serious tone, before stopping himself. Everyone waited for the rest, as they watched a grin creep up on Rappa's face as he continued, You are easily one of the strongest people I've ever faced. I had such a blast. I want to face you again Sunday, so I need you to get out of this alive." With an excited and joyful voice, Midoriya was shocked to hear this, but it made him happy. He had earned the respect of a strong fighter, and he couldn't help but also want to face Rappa again someday. This exchange was cut short, however, when banging could be heard from the barricaded door. Rappa quickly turned his full attention towards the door as he shouted, "I'll hold them off, run and don't look back." The teens didn't need to be told twice and quickly took off running through the secret underground tunnel. They couldn't help but feel bad for Rappa, but there was no other way. They prayed that they would meet him again. If they didn't, they would have to make sure that his sacrifice wasn't in vain. Outro. Thank you all for sticking around, and I hope that you enjoyed. Before you leave, we would just like to let you know that We the Celestials has many other channels for your entertainment and viewing purposes. All the information you'll need is right below here in the description, so feel free to check out all the other incredible projects our team creates. Secondly, on behalf of We the Celestials, I'd like to thank everyone involved in the production of today's awesome content. Their details will be in the description below. That's all for today's video, so goodbye and have a divine day. Hey, what is up, mortals? Welcome to Season 2 Part 1 of What If Quirks Were Outlawed. I just wanted to greet you guys by just saying, sit back and relax, you're in for a treat. So, we begin. The AQTF made quick work of everyone in the fight club, overwhelming them with both man and quirk power. Everyone was restrained, cuffed, and unarmed before being taken away, all except for one. That was Overhaul, and he was being held in the same spot that they had caught him in. The AQTF wouldn't have many good reasons to do this, but he could still think of some. He imagined that they would interrogate him with some inhumane methods, which in turn meant that they needed something from him. The mask-wearing Yakuza sat waiting in his chair, with multiple guns pointed at him, until a man walked into the room. This individual wore an AQTF uniform just like everyone else, but his version of it gave the impression of a much higher rank. He was also covered in an abundance of hands, which was enough for Overhaul to identify this person. Tamura Shigaraki, the Yakuza muttered, his cold voice showing a hint of anger. Shigaraki grinned upon hearing this, as he slowly approached Overhaul and said, "So you've heard about me. That's good. It'll make things much easier." With a sadistic voice, Overhaul could feel the pure evil that came from this man's voice, but he didn't let it faze him. Shigaraki continued to grin at Overhaul, before he continued by saying, "A little bird told me that a special group of people were here tonight. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that?" With the same amount of sadism as before, Overhaul knew who Shigaraki was talking about. The vigilantes. Word must have reached them quickly, which could be part of the reason that they're here. The easy way out would be to talk, but he wasn't going to do that. Not only did he have a deal with him, he also had high respect for Dekoru. He wouldn't rat him out for anything. "We get a lot of visitors, so I'm afraid that I don't know what you're talking about," Overhaul answered, dodging the question while hoping that Shigaraki would take it as the truth. This didn't happen, however, as the hand-covered man continued by saying, "Oh, but you do know who I'm talking about. You wouldn't mind telling me what hole the vigilante rats escaped through?" With a more playful tone this time, Overhaul silently cursed, for there was no way to get out of this without being hurt. Dekoru and his friends must have escaped through one of the secret tunnels, but he still refused to sell them out. The mask-wearing Yakuza shrugged lightly, before answering by saying, "Why would I know where they are?" With the same cold voice as before, Shigaraki stood silent for a while, until he punched Overhaul out of his chair. The Yakuza grunted in pain and got a bruise, as he fell onto his knees. "Wrong answer, try again," Shigaraki then said, sounding more sadistic than before. Overhaul remained silent this time, refusing to answer. Shigaraki grew impatient, until grinned even more and said, "I thought I would let you know this. Everything you've owned and worked for now belongs to us, and you will never have a part in it again." With the same voice as before, Overhaul was infuriated upon hearing this. The mere idea of the AQTF using his resources and supplies boiled his blood, and it reached a critical point. The Yakuza's gloves tore themselves apart, signaling quirk usage as he reached for the ground. He was abruptly stopped, however, by something sharp and fast cutting through all of his limbs. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," a new voice said, making Overhaul look up to see. This person was also wearing an AQTF uniform, but what made him stand out were the giant red wings on his back. Overhaul immediately recognized this person as one of the greatest agents that the AQTF had to offer, Hawks. Shigaraki looked at the bleeding and pathetic Overhaul, until he looked at the officers that were guarding him and spoke. "Do you call that unarming?" he asked with a tone that was both sadistic and angry. The officers didn't answer Shigaraki, as he squatted down to Overhaul's level while saying, "This is how you unarm someone." Quite manically, as he reached for the arms of the pathetic and horrified Yakuza, Midoriya and the others managed to get to safety. The tunnel had led them to an alleyway that was far from the AQTF's reach, just like Rappa had told them. Now they just needed to get back to the hideout and treat Midoriya's wounds. But the newest additions of the group didn't seem to get that. What do we do now? Ashido asked, keeping her eyes peeled for any sign of danger. Kirishima was carrying Midoriya with the help of Ajiro, as he answered by saying, now we get to the hideout so that the others can help us with Dekoru. With a calm voice, Ajiro looked intrigued upon hearing this, as he asked, hideout, so there are more vigilantes? With a tone that was a mixture between curiosity and shock. Kirishima's expression remained calm, as he answered, yes, and I had the exact same reaction as you. Now, we need to find the others before Kirishima said, but was cut off by someone joining in and saying, before they find you. This voice was completely unknown to most of the group, except for Kirishima and Midoriya. The two looked towards the source of said voice, and said, Aizo, call me Eraserhead out here. The man cut them off, almost sounding a little annoyed. The newcomers were confused, but they calmed down when realizing that both Kirishima and Midoriya knew this man. Aizawa came closer to them, Midoriya more specifically, before looking very angry and saying, you are a magnet for trouble, you're lucky that I followed you down there. With a tone that sounded like a teacher scolding his student. Midoriya and Kirishima were shocked to hear that Aizawa had followed them, but then realized that it was a good thing. Rappa seemed to have trouble with his quirk during the fight, which could only mean one thing. So you were hiding in the crowd and erasing Rappa's quirk, Midoriya stated, finding it hard to speak through his injuries. Kirishima already thought that someone in the crowd had been interfering, and therefore he was relieved to hear that it was Aizawa and not some criminal that would later ask for compensation. The others, however, were shocked. They believed that Midoriya was the one who was messing with Rappa's quirk, but that turned out to be false. What was the green-haired vigilante's quirk? Was it something so dangerous that he couldn't afford to use it even against Rappa? The newcomers pondered these questions, as Aizawa got back on track by saying, you're too reckless. You should have called and waited for backup before entering. That way we could have done this in a much safer fashion. But, at the same time, I'm glad that you went in when you did. If you had waited for backup it would have been too late, and I sense that you gained something valuable down there. With a voice that slowly went from scolding to relief. Midoriya was confused upon hearing this. He could tell that Aizawa wasn't talking about the three that they just saved, so what could that have been? The green vigilante was about to come to an answer, but his thoughts were stopped by Aizawa once more. We should head back. The others should be waiting for us by now, the tired-looking man said, before proceeding to walk out of the alleyway. Everyone started to follow him, with Ajiro and Kirishima still carrying Midoriya. The green-haired boy, however, was having it rough. His injuries made his chest feel heavy. As such, it made it hard for him to breathe properly. The only person to notice this was Uraraka, as she nervously looked at her own trembling hands before she walked up to the injured vigilante. Everyone stopped and looked at her in confusion as she said, "Oh, let me help you," with a trembling voice, before reaching her trembling hand towards Midoriya's chest. After contact, the green-haired boy could feel how part of his body turned weightless, which made it easier for him to breathe. "Thank you," Midoriya muttered, sounding like he was taking the first breath of his life. Uraraka smiled gently upon hearing this, knowing that she did something right. They then proceeded to move out, with a Midoriya that was much easier to carry now. With the help of Aizawa, they managed to get Midoriya to the hideout, but no one would be ready for the thing that was waiting for them. Upon arriving, they were met by Stain, but something was clearly off about him. He wasn't his usual ominous self. He looked worried and anxious. "Where the hell have you been?" the crimson-clad vigilante shouted, not registering that there were 3 new faces in the building. Aizawa was thrown off by Stain's behavior, and responded by saying, "Midoriya managed to get himself into more trouble. Is something wrong?" With a concerned voice, Stain was silent for a moment, finally registering how injured Midoriya was, before saying, "It's Toshinori. He was fatally injured during his patrol. It's really bad." With the same voice as before, the eyes of Aizawa, Midoriya and Kirishima widened with shock and panic as Aizawa quickly said, "Keep an eye on the newcomers," before he and Kirishima carried Midoriya into the other room. Upon entering, they saw what they feared the most. Toshinori was lying on a bed, covered with bandaged injuries. His face looked pale, and one could clearly see how he struggled to breathe. Midoriya was horrified by this sight, as his eyes searched the room. Next to Toshinori was Bakugo, and he looked just as horrified. The ashen blonde looked at the trio with distraught eyes, as he said, "We found him all beaten and injured when we came back. We tried to help him, but he's not getting better," with a voice that perfectly mirrored his expression. Everyone panicked even more upon hearing this, as they hurried up the bed of the injured man. Toshinori coughed painfully, as he opened his tired eyes and looked towards the trio. "There you are. I was starting to get worried for you," the injured man said, voice straining through many layers of pain. The trio were even more pained upon hearing Toshinori speak, as Aizawa asked, "What happened to you?" with a trembling voice. Toshinori coughed again, before he painfully answered by saying, The leader of the AQTF did this. He's someone I've fought before, and someone that I needed to defeat, but I failed. With a voice that sounded like he was loathing himself at the moment. Everyone was shocked to hear this. They've heard rumors and stories about the leader of the AQTF, but they have never encountered him once. If Toshinori lost to him once and was injured by him now, what more could he be capable of? The trio looked bewildered as Toshinori looked towards Midoriya. You looked pretty banged up. Did something happen? The blonde man said, before coughing violently. Midoriya shook upon hearing this, as he tried to gather himself before saying, we got into some trouble, but we managed to find and rescue the people we were looking for. With a trembling voice, Toshinori smiled upon hearing this, as he said, that's good, I never doubted you for a second, so I need to ask you a favor, young Midoriya, sounding like he was holding his coughs in. Midoriya looked confused upon hearing this, as the blonde man reached and grabbed one of his hands while saying, I need you to take my quirk, young Midoriya, before finally coughing. Everyone in the room looked shocked and confused. Toshinori spoke as if he could pass his quirk on to others, but that couldn't be real. It wasn't. He began to explain how it worked, and parts of its history, that they realized how real it actually was. His quirk was called One for All. It's a quirk that stockpiles power over time, and it has been passed down on among 8 people so far. The quirk was created and passed on for the sole purpose of defeating the AQTF and its leader, All for One. I was quirkless, just like you, before my master gave me One for All. She hoped that I could finally put an end to the AQTF, but I failed her. That is why I'm asking you to accept it. I need you to continue the battle for me, and to lead us to a brighter future. Please, young Midoriya. The blonde man then said, as he plucked and held out a strand of his hair. Midoriya was frozen, so was everyone else. They all knew what this implied. It was a decision that would change his life forever. If Midoriya accepted this power, there was no turning back. He would be forever bloodbound to the life of vigilantism. The green-haired boy looked decisively at the strand of hair that was held by the trembling hand of Toshinori. How could he be the one that he chose? In this room alone there were at least 2 others that would be a better choice, so why him? Midoriya couldn't find an answer to this, but decided that it didn't matter. What mattered was that Toshinori wanted him to be his successor, and by accepting the quirk he would accept the burden of the 8 users that came before him. The green-haired boy reached for the hair with a trembling hand, until he managed to grab hold of it. He then swallowed it, before saying, I hope that I can live up to your expectations. With teary eyes, Toshinori only smiled upon seeing this, as he responded by saying, you already have, young man. With a weak voice, Toshinori then let his trembling hand go limp, as he felt his body getting lighter and lighter. He carries our power now, master. He will lead us to a brighter future. The blonde man said with his last breath, before he closed his eyes for the last time. Everyone in the room was still and silent. Then a loud thud was heard as Midoriya fell to the ground and began trembling. After that, Stain burst into the room with the other teens behind him, wondering what that loud thud was. They all stopped in silence, however, when they witnessed the lifeless body of Toshinori. Stain dropped the knife that he was holding, as Midoriya curled up and began crying. This was followed by Bakugo, who shouted, damn it, in pain and anguish, before readying himself to destroy something with his explosions. He was quickly stopped, however, by Kirishima, who grabbed and held him down from behind. Let go of me, you crook. Bakugo shouted in more anguish, sprattling and moving to break free from Kirishima's hold. The redhead didn't budge, holding in his own sorrow as he said, you need to calm down. This won't bring him back, in a way that he knew would reach Bakugo. The blonde stopped struggling, realizing that Kirishima was right. He resorted to clenching his fists and gritting his teeth as tears began falling from his eyes. Midoriya was still curled up on the ground and crying his eyes out. He was so lost in it that he barely noticed how Uraraka had walked up and put her hand on his shoulder. The green-haired boy barely gave it any recognition, however, and continued mourning. What followed for the vigilantes was many long minutes, maybe hours, of silent mourning. Aizawa covered Toshinori with a white blanket before putting him into another room, while Stain began treating Midoriya's injuries. No one uttered a single sound during this time. Everyone just knew exactly what to do and how to help each other. After everything was done, they sat in silence, trying to fully comprehend everything that was happening. Most didn't know what to do, especially those that knew Toshinori. If this All for One could defeat him, what hope did they have? Was there even a way for them to win? What should we do? Kirishima muttered, his voice heavily weighed down by his mood. The room was silent for a long while, for no one had an answer. They were clearly at their lowest point, and no one knew how to get up again. The silence continued until an answer broke it. We honor Toshinori's legacy, and we do it by continuing the battle. A voice said. Everyone looked in shock to see that it was Midoriya, and he looked like he had found a new form of determination. Toshinori died for this cause, so we're going to make sure that his death wasn't in vain. We'll continue fighting until we win, until the AQTF is no more. the green-haired boy said, his determination not leaving his voice. Everyone was shocked upon hearing this, not knowing what to say. That is when Bakugo spoke up. You'll need an army to do that. And the AQTF has all of society turned against people like us. The blonde said, his voice being passive-aggressive. Midoriya's expression didn't change, as he looked towards Bakugo and said, haven't you ever wondered why society is turned against us? Why they never let the media report on anything that we're doing? It's because they know that people will follow us, so they control how society sees us in an effort to stop us from gaining followers. But we can change that. With the same voice as before, everyone was equally shocked now, and they were even curious. That is when Aizawa spoke up. If we let people see us more often, we change how they view us, and the media will write about us. The tired man said, having finally understood what Midoriya was trying to say. Midoriya nodded towards Aizawa as he continued, we'll let people know that we exist, and we'll show them that they can fight back. The green-haired boy said, sounding more determined. Everyone was even more shocked to hear this and started to think. Hiroshima, on the other hand, started to giggle as he said, so you'll tell everyone that they can do it? Your nickname suits you even more now, Dekaru. With a more joyous tone. Midoriya cringed a little upon hearing this, while some of the others giggled at his reaction. Bakugo was one of those, and he then said, Dekaru, I like it. Not only does it have a good ring to it, it suits you well. With a much friendlier tone. Midoriya cringed even more, realizing that he would never escape that nickname. Stain was impressed by Midoriya. He showed a determination that he had rarely seen, and he now knew that he was someone who shared his beliefs. It could work. It's a high risk, but there's an equally high reward. Aizawa then said, having finished his take on Midoriya's statement. Everyone listened to his words before Bakugo spoke up and said, I'm with you, just don't bring me on any more suicide missions. With a determined voice. This was followed by Kirishima, who said, I'm with you too, let's beat those bastards, sounding like he was getting fired up. I'm with you too, Ajiro then said. So am I. Ashido followed. As same here. Uraraka then finished, her voice trembling slightly. The teens then formed a circle of hands, showing that they were all on board with this. The ones who remained were Stain and Aizawa, who looked at each other before smiling and saying, we're with you too, problem child, with a little hint of determination behind his voice. They too joined the circle of hands, looking at each other with determined looks, until Midoriya spoke up. Toshinori's death will not be vain. We'll beat the AQTF and change society for the better. The green-haired boy shouted, sounding like he had never been uncertain in his entire life. The others shouted in confirmation to his words, agreeing with everything that he said. Midoriya looked at his companions one more time, before finishing by saying, let's do this. Outro. Thank you all for sticking around, and I hope that you enjoyed. Before you leave, we would just like to let you know that We the Celestials has many other channels for your entertainment and viewing purposes. All the information you'll need is right below here in the description, so feel free to check out all the other incredible projects our team creates. Secondly, on behalf of We the Celestials, I'd like to thank everyone involved in the production of today's awesome content. Their details will be in the description below. That's all for today's video, so goodbye and have a divine day. Hey, what is up, mortals? Welcome to Season 2 Part 2 of What If Quirks Were Outlawed. I just wanted to greet you guys by just saying, sit back and relax, you're in for a treat. So, we begin. The night was as it always was, busy. The AQTF were patrolling like they always do, stopping criminals and evildoers wherever they found one. A new type of enemy had become more frequent, however, that was the vigilantes. For the longest time the public had been unaware of the existence of the vigilantes, but that suddenly changed one day. News reporters somehow managed to get their hands on that information, and the story spread like wildfire. Stories about events that regarded AQTF officers, encounters with criminals, and many other things were reported, and it painted the vigilantes in a more positive light. This led to a massive debate within society. Were the vigilantes evil? Are they right or are they wrong? The debate started in favor of the AQTF, but it soon divided society as the vigilantes began showing themselves more. People started to sympathize with the vigilantes, and the AQTF didn't take that lightly. Their activity increased more than ever, pouring more resources and deploying more agents to deal with the problem. One of those agents was Tensei Ada, codenamed Ingenium. He was out chasing the lead of a vigilante, one that they considered to be very dangerous, and he would stop at nothing to bring him in. The vigilantes were a representation of the things that plagued society, so they will not walk free. Ingenium kept speeding through the streets, following the trail and shadow of his target. In his eyes, the vigilante was no more than his prey, so he wasn't afraid. The agent chased this trail for a while, until it led him to a dark and secluded alleyway. The armored agent stopped and carefully observed his surroundings, only to be confused. There wasn't a single trace of the person he was chasing, nothing at all. Ingenium was furious, concluding that the vigilante had run off like the coward he was. That is when the sound of something landing appeared behind him. Ingenium turned around, only to find the person he was looking for. It was a sword-wielding maniac, clad in crimson. The armored speedster carefully observed the vigilante, until he said, "I finally caught up to you. Now there's nowhere to hide." With a menacing voice, the vigilante didn't budge for anything. It was as if he hadn't even heard him speak. Ingenium got annoyed upon seeing this and said, "It's time that I put you where you belong." Before charging at the vigilante, Ingenium was going full speed, so there was no way to avoid it. Shockingly, however, it was exactly what the vigilante did. He avoided the first hit by calmly dodging. Ingenium was surprised by this but didn't let it show as he went for another hit, only to realize that he couldn't. He was suddenly on the ground, completely unable to move. Ingenium didn't know what was happening. He was just paralyzed. He did notice that he had a small bleeding cut in one of the openings in his armor. But how could that be the cause of his paralysis? The agent tried to force his body to move, as the footsteps of the approaching vigilante neared him. "No, it's time that I send you to where you belong," the vigilante said, his voice being as dark and menacing as anything could. Ingenium was horrified by this. He couldn't move, and a maniacal vigilante was steadily approaching him. He then got a good look into the bloodthirsty and malicious eyes of the vigilante, filling him with even more terror. The vigilante tightened the grip around his sword, before raising it over his head and shouting, "Straight to hell," with even more ferocity. Ingenium stared at the approaching sword in utter terror. He believed that he was the hunter, but it turns out that he was the prey. That was the last thing that went through Ingenium's mind, before the alleyway was filled with a blood-curdling scream. Midoriya had changed for the better. His confidence had gone up and he had gotten stronger. It wasn't just the fact that he had a quirk now, but his overall abilities improved. He had better combat skills, better mobility, and better decision-making. To top it off, he now had one for all powering him in everything that he did. He was basically a novice when it came to using the quirk. But with the help of his companions, he managed to at least get some control over it. If that wasn't enough, he always analyzed his opponents, before trying to incorporate whatever he found useful into his own style. All of these factors combined made Midoriya into a very valuable and competent member of the Vigilantes. He was so competent that they sometimes let him patrol on his own. This was one of those times. The night was lively, and for a good reason. During Midoriya's recovery, the Vigilantes had followed the plan and idea that he had presented, and it was showing results. The public now knew of them, and they had managed to put society into a heated debate. This meant that Midoriya's plan was working, but of course that came with its own downsides. The AQTF were more active and brutal than ever, and this night was no different. Midoriya was alone tonight, stopping whatever crime that he could. Unfortunately for him, the AQTF caught wind of his whereabouts and began storming the area in no time. The green-haired vigilante was just about to leave, but stopped when he saw something that caught his eye. It was someone that was with the AQTF with a slim build and blonde hair. What shocked him was how young he was, for he looked to be just 1 or 2 years older than Midoriya. At first he wondered why he was there, but then realized that he was probably what people called a rookie or an AQTF in training. Midoriya didn't get to think much more of it, however, before he had to run. He quickly took off into the alleyways, hiding in the shadows as much as he could, and getting as far away from the enemy as possible. Eventually, he was far away enough to make it to one of the rooftops without being seen. The green-haired vigilante was about to climb the fire escape and get to the rooftop, but he was abruptly stopped by a powerful kick. The attack missed him by a hair and crashed into the escape ladder that he was holding, but it still was enough to make Midoriya throw himself back. The vigilante panted heavily at uneven pace, shocked by the sudden attack. As he analyzed his mysterious attacker, Midoriya was surprised by what he saw. It was a boy that was the same age as him, with blue hair and glasses. What made him stand out more were the mufflers on his calves, which Midoriya assumed was his quirk. Midoriya was confused, and with good reason. This kid didn't look like a street thug, but he didn't look like he was with the AQTF either. He looked like any law-obeying individual, so why was he here? And why did he possibly use his quirk to attack him? The green-haired boy managed to calm down his breathing before he decided to speak up. "You're not with the AQTF, and you're not a criminal either. So who are you and what are you doing here?" Midoriya said, sounding as calm as he could muster. The blue-haired boy looked angry as he looked at the vigilante and said, "My name is Tenya Ida, and I'm here to put an end to you." With an aggressive tone, Midoriya was thrown off by this. He was used to aggressive tones by now, but this one seemed different. It was filled with loathing, like Ada genuinely hated Midoriya for some reason. Another thing that threw him off was the fact that he had said his name so recklessly. This told Midoriya 1 out of 3 things. Ada possibly didn't know the importance of a secret identity when doing these kinds of things, or he knew but didn't care, or it could be that he was sure that it wouldn't be a problem. If it was the last part, it lined up with what the blue-haired boy had just said. He was here to kill Midoriya. "What did I ever do to you?" Midoriya asked, hoping to get an answer. Ada just looked more angry than before as he shouted, "What did you do? You killed my older brother." With rage in his voice, Midoriya was once again shocked. This was a response he hadn't expected. He expected Ada to say something about breaking the law, but he was accusing Midoriya of murder. Ada saw the vigilante's face of confusion and was enraged even further. "Don't act like you don't know. You and your people killed my brother, Tensei. He was the AQTF agent known as Ingenium, and you carved him open. You slaughtered him like an animal." The blue-haired boy shouted, sounding like he was emotionally pained as he did. This outburst made Midoriya jump a little, but he tried his best to hide it. He didn't know of any agent named Ingenium, but that wasn't what caught his attention. What caught his attention was Ada's specific choice of words. He said carved him open, which implies that the killer might have used some sort of blade. That, coupled with the fact that Ada seemed to be convinced that a vigilante was responsible, made him think of the only blade-wielding vigilante that he knew. Midoriya quickly shook these thoughts out of his head, for he needed to stay focused, as he said, "I don't know what you're talking about, but I'm sorry for your loss, and it would appear that I have something to discuss with my allies when I get back." With a calm voice, Ada just got more annoyed, as he said, "No, you won't discuss anything with anyone, because you'll die right here." With a burning fury, as he charged towards the vigilante, Midoriya had remained focused and therefore could avoid Ada's attack. But it was close. The blue-haired boy was fast, but Midoriya has faced way worse. Ada then prepared to throw an incredibly powerful kick towards Midoriya's skull, but the green-haired vigilante didn't let him. The green-haired boy channeled 8% of one for all into his right arm, before throwing it into Ada's face. The blue-haired teen staggered back, as Midoriya threw blow after blow into his face. Eventually it was too much, and Ada dropped to the ground unconscious. "Sorry, but I'd rather not be killed by you in a dark and secluded alleyway," Midoriya then said, panting lightly as he did. The green-haired boy then gathered himself, as he carefully scanned the area. The AQTF would probably find him soon, especially since Ada had decided to make so much noise. He needed to leave, but he couldn't just leave Ada there. The AQTF had no mercy. Therefore Ada would end up in trouble if he was just left there. "I guess I can't just leave you here like this," the green-haired boy said to himself, while looking at the unconscious Ada. "Why bother helping your enemy? I thought it would cause you more harm than good." A voice then said, responding to Midoriya's words. The green-haired boy froze upon hearing this, as he turned towards the source of the voice. What he saw was none other than that same blonde kid from earlier, the one he thought looked like a rookie. Midoriya almost panicked, for this was bad. If the rookie was here, it meant that he didn't have much time before he was swarmed, and when that happened it would be over. He quickly calmed himself, however, and tried to make a plan. He didn't have the time to fight, but he couldn't just escape either. Unless he wanted to be chased, he needed to shake this rookie. Luckily, it seemed like this rookie had been way ahead of everyone else, so at least he had some time to do something. "Unlike you, I don't wish to needlessly harm my enemies," Midoriya said, hoping that an answer would keep the blonde at bay. The rookie looked surprised to hear this, but he didn't follow up with another question. The two stared each other down, both waiting for the other to move. Midoriya's eyes quickly glanced at his escape ladder, and the rookie clearly noticed it. "You look new. Are you perhaps a rookie?" Midoriya then asked calmly. The blonde reacted weirdly upon hearing this, as he looked at the vigilante and said, "Does it matter whether I'm a rookie or not?" Almost sounding a little annoyed. Midoriya knew that he couldn't hope for a direct answer, but he still got what he wanted. The blonde's reaction said it all. He was indeed a rookie. This also meant that Midoriya could possibly use tricks that wouldn't work on regular agents. The green vigilante looked towards the ladder once more, as he said, "Yes, it does matter a lot actually," before looking at the blonde once again. The rookie looked like he was ready after hearing this, which is what Midoriya wanted to see. The two then stared at each other in silence, before Midoriya suddenly took off. The green-haired boy used 8% of one for all in his legs to quickly dash over to the ladder, reaching it in the blink of an eye. "You're too obvious," the rookie then shouted, as he appeared right next to Midoriya. The blonde looked like he had won, and was about to throw a punch at the vigilante. He was interrupted, however, by Midoriya, who hit him with a punch that was charged with one for all. The blonde was knocked back, and Midoriya didn't waste any time. He charged and threw another punch at the blonde, only to have it phasing through him. Midoriya was shocked to see this, as the blonde suddenly fell through the floor. The green-haired vigilante could only assume that this was the rookie's quirk, the ability to phase through solid matter. This meant that the blonde could appear anywhere, but if his combat experience has taught him anything, it's that people tend to go for the same blind spots. Midoriya quickly turned around, just in time to throw a punch at the recently appearing blonde. The rookie was thrown back once more, and he was in even more shock than before. The vigilante didn't pause, however, and went in for another attack, only to have it phase through again. The blonde then threw a punch at the vigilante, but it was blocked as he jumped back. Both fighters stopped and panted, both being awestruck about the other's abilities. Midoriya was amazed by the control that this rookie had over his quirk, while the blonde was amazed by the vigilante's combat. This amazement caused a huge pause in their fight, and that pause made the blonde realize something. "You're the vigilante that defeated Sir Night-Eye, the one called Dekaru," the blonde said, panting a little as he did. Midoriya didn't expect to hear this, but he remained calm as he said, "Yes, so what?" With a calm voice. The blonde continued to pant as he answered, "He's my mentor, he told me about you." Midoriya was surprised to hear this, but this explained a lot. If this rookie was being trained by Night-Eye, it shouldn't be surprising that he has such good quirk control. This also made the green-haired boy weary, for Night-Eye's pupil could potentially be as cold-blooded as Night-Eye. "Your mentor is a demon. He tried to seriously injure, if not kill, me and my friends," the vigilante said, sounding a little angry as he did. The blonde didn't take this lightly, as he said, "Sir is an upholder of the law. He and the AQTF protects society and its people." With an equally angry voice, Midoriya just got angrier upon hearing this, as he said, "Do you seriously believe that? Or are you just naive?" With an aggressive tone. The blonde was shocked to hear this kind of tone from the vigilante, and remained silent. Both had stopped panting by now, as Midoriya continued by saying, "If the AQTF are the protectors of society, why are they terrorizing its people? Why can they decide to beat any teenage kid half to death for just using their quirk? And why aren't they trying to help people who are forced to live on the street?" With the same tone as before. The blonde was shocked upon hearing this, but he didn't change his tone as he said, "You're a law-breaking vigilante. You bring disorder to society. What would you know about this?" Midoriya was unfazed by this. He was running out of time, but he couldn't leave just yet. He needed to set this rookie straight, and it brought him to something that Toshinori had said a while back. After his encounter with Night-Eye, Toshinori had told Midoriya about his connection to him, and it made the green-haired boy sick to think about. "I assume that your mentor never told you about what he was and used to do before joining the AQTF. Your precious Night-Eye used to be a law-breaking vigilante," the green-haired boy said, not changing his tone for a second. The blonde was both shocked and angry to hear this, and Midoriya could tell that he didn't believe it to be true. "You can ask him yourself if you don't believe me, but do me a favor and ask him something else while you're at it. Ask him about Toshinori Yagi, the friend that he betrayed and left to die without a second thought," Midoriya then said, intending this to be his final words. The two were silent once more. The blonde was processing everything that the vigilante had told him, while Midoriya was looking for an opening. That opening came when the sound of other AQTF officers approaching the area could be heard, which distracted and caught the blonde off guard. Midoriya saw his opportunity, as he channeled 100% of One for All into his finger before flicking it towards the blonde. The force from the flick created a powerful blast of wind that hit the blonde in the head, greatly disorienting him. Midoriya did break his finger in the process of doing this, but it didn't stop him. He only grunted in pain as he quickly made his way to the ladder. The vigilante climbed the ladder, before stopping when he was about halfway up. He looked down and saw that Ida was just about to wake up from his unconscious state. Midoriya wanted to go down and help him out of there, but the approaching officers stopped him from doing so. There was no way to help Ida and get to safety. If Midoriya wanted to escape, he would have to leave Ida behind to act as a decoy. But that would mean leaving him to suffer pain that he never would wish upon his worst enemy. Midoriya gritted his teeth and clenched his fist hard, as he muttered, "I'm sorry, Ida," before proceeding to climb the ladder with haste. The officers did as Midoriya expected. They focused mostly on Ida and the blonde. The green-haired boy didn't stay for too long, however, for it was only a matter of time before the blonde pointed out his escape route. He did stay long enough, however, to hear the codename of that naive rookie, "A million," he muttered as he ran across the rooftops. Midoriya reported the night's events to Aizawa, and immediately got help with curing his broken finger. Everyone was back by now, and they were cooperating nicely. The other teens were praising Midoriya for his work, but the green-haired boy couldn't hear any of it. He was too focused on another individual that was sitting silently in the room, Stain. He couldn't get Ada's words out of his head, for they always gave him the same picture. It matched no one but Stain, but he didn't want to believe that one of his own allies was a murderer. On the other hand, it would explain the eerie and ominous feeling that he sometimes gets from the crimson-clad vigilante. Midoriya kept staring at Stain, until Stain looked back. Their eyes were now locked with one another across the room, and it sent chills down Midoriya's spine. It wasn't that Stain looked threatening, he was grinning. This was enough for the green-haired boy. He needed answers. He got up from his seat and walked towards Stain, who had done the exact same. The two met up in the middle of the room and stopped. Everyone looked at the two in silence, until Midoriya broke it. "We need to talk," the green-haired boy said, sounding serious. Stain continued to grin upon hearing this as he, with a hint of satisfaction, responded by saying, "Yeah, it's about time that we did so." Outro. Thank you all for sticking around, and I hope that you enjoyed. Before you leave, we would just like to let you know that We the Celestials has many other channels for your entertainment and viewing purposes. All the information you'll need is right below here in the description, so feel free to check out all the other incredible projects our team creates. Secondly, on behalf of We the Celestials, I'd like to thank everyone involved in the production of today's awesome content. Their details will be in the description below. That's all for today's video, so goodbye and have a divine day. Hey, what is up, mortals? Welcome to Season 2 Part 3 of What If Quirks Were Outlawed. I just wanted to greet you guys by just saying, sit back and relax, you're in for a treat. So, we begin. Midoriya and Stain went to talk in private, and it was tense. Even after they had entered the room and made sure that no one else would hear them, it was silent, like they were waiting for the other to speak. I'm not going to sit here and waste your time, so I'll get straight to the point, Midoriya then said, breaking the silence. Stain held a neutral expression as he looked at Midoriya. The green-haired boy was a little nervous. He didn't want to think that Stain was guilty of murder, but his mind needed answers to move on. During my patrol today, I encountered someone odd. He claimed that I, a vigilante, was responsible for his brother's death. Apparently, his brother was some AQTF agent called Ingenium, and he claimed that he had been carved open, Midoriya said, hiding his nervousness with a calm voice. Stain's eyes went a little wide upon hearing this, but they quickly went back to their regular manner as he said, if you're going to ask if I was involved with this, I'll save you the trouble. Yes, I killed him. With a cold voice, Midoriya was horrified to hear this. He didn't want to believe it, but it was true. Stain had killed someone, and it looked like he didn't feel any remorse about it. Why did you do it? Midoriya asked, his voice showing that he was horrified. Stain didn't change his expression as he said, you ask why I did it. It's because they need to go. How much pain have they caused? How much have they taken? How many more of my comrades need to fall before society realizes how terrible they actually are? With his usual bloody voice, Midoriya shook and was even more horrified now. Stain was right. The AQTF has taken so much from so many people, but that doesn't mean that killing is the right option. You should understand this. You have seen and experienced the true colors of the AQTF. You should be the one that agrees with me. Stain then said, using the same voice as before. Midoriya lowered his head upon hearing this, and Stain smiled. He knew that the green-haired boy would agree with him, and this action showed that he did. Stain waited for Midoriya's response until he spoke up. Uraraka, he said, his voice being calm and silent. Stain was confused upon hearing this, as Midoriya continued. Her family suffered discrimination at the hands of the AQTF. Her parents owned a construction company that was shut down because they all had quirks. They were forced into poverty, and she was forced onto the streets where she met Ashido and the others. With the same voice as before, Stain was even more confused now as Midoriya continued to speak. Both Ajiro and Ashido have obvious quirks, therefore they were constantly attacked for it. They too ended up on the street, all because of society. Kirishima and Bakugo are far more similar than they ever will admit. They were born with quirks, were discriminated against because of it, and gained an aggressive attitude that further villainized them in the eyes of everyone else. The difference between them would be that Bakugo ended up with the vigilantes, while Kirishima ended up as a petty criminal. All five of them are different people, but they have things in common. 1. They have all suffered more than I have. 2. They don't agree with you. The green-haired boy said, his voice sounding as calm as it did before. Stain was even more shocked now. He hadn't stopped to fully listen to everyone's backstory, but Midoriya did. He couldn't fully understand him. Why would he stop and listen to everyone? The green-haired boy looked at Stain, his eyes being angry as he shouted, they have suffered more. If anyone should agree with you, it's them. But they don't, so why should I? Why should I, someone who was quirkless until just recently, someone who didn't know pain until becoming a vigilante, someone who threw away his chance at a normal and great life for the sake of this cause, ever agree with you? With rage in his voice, Stain was thrown back by this, but he finally understood Midoriya. The green-haired boy took the time to listen to everyone because he cared. He genuinely cared. He wanted to change society, knowing full well that it wouldn't benefit him if it did. He even gave up his quirklessness, knowing full well that there was no turning back afterwards. He was selfless and would happily sacrifice himself. He was what Toshinori would have called a hero. The two vigilantes stared each other down until the door flung open. What is going on here? The voice of Aizawa asked, wondering what the aggressive shouting had been about. Midoriya looked at Stain in disgust as he asked, do you want to tell him what you did? With an angry voice, Stain looked away and Aizawa was confused until Midoriya spoke up. He murdered an AQTF agent, the green-haired boy said. Aizawa was shocked to hear this, but he quickly regained his composure as he asked, did the agent have any relatives? With a worried tone, Midoriya didn't change his expression as he answered, yes, his little brother came for vengeance during my patrol. Aizawa was even more worried now. Killing an AQTF agent was not a good idea, especially since they were starting to gain support and recognition. A murder could easily be used against them, And they didn't need that. Was it on purpose? Aizawa then asked, hoping that it was an accident. His hopes, however, would be instantly crushed as Midoriya answered, yes, and he didn't even try to hide it from me. With an angry tone. Aizawa was starting to get angry now, as he looked at Stain and said, you know how easy it is for the AQTF to turn everything against us, and you still kill one of them. Did you ever consider that it would cause us more trouble? That we could get attacked by a vengeful relative just like Midoriya? With an angry tone, Stain continued to look away and didn't answer any of Aizawa's questions. The tired man was even more annoyed by this, but he shrugged most of it off as he said, we'll deal with you later. Right now we need to plan our next move. With a tone that clearly showed his annoyance, Midoriya nodded in agreement to this as they walked through the door and left with Stain. They needed to do something about him, but that could wait. During these times they all needed to work together. That included Stain. This didn't change how they viewed him now, and they needed to be cautious with his words and actions. He may be a competent and valuable member of the team, but they couldn't bring themselves to trust him right now. Mirio was lost. Not only had he encountered Dekoru, but he had failed to capture him. The vigilante was smarter and more tactical than he thought. He even played him for a fool. He was bothered by that and what the vigilante had said, but there was something else. Before their fight, Dekoru had encountered someone else. Mirio had later been informed that it was the younger brother of the late Ingenium, but that didn't make what happened any better. When the other officers had swarmed into the scene, they had surrounded it and began to beat on him without any remorse. Mirio had even tried to stop them, only to be pushed back and told to stay out of it. He didn't know what to think anymore. He always believed that the AQTF were the good side, but recent events only seemed to amplify the things that Dekoru told him. Mirio needed answers, and he needed to know if what Dekoru said about Night Eye was true. He needed to know if he was on the right side, or if he had been naive all this time. The blonde made it through the halls with a goal in mind, until he stopped at a certain door. He knocked, and was quickly given the clear to enter. On the other side of the door was Night Eye, sitting at his desk with a pile of papers. The agent looked up towards Mirio with a neutral expression as he asked, how did your patrol go? With a calm voice, Mirio looked down as he answered, it didn't go so well. With a voice that showed some form of shame. Night Eye was curious upon hearing this as he asked, what makes you say that? Mirio continued to look down as he scratched the back of his head and said, we had an encounter with one of the vigilantes. It was Dekoru, and he managed to escape. With a voice that was similar to the one he used before. Night Eye's eyes widened upon hearing this as he said, I see, that explains a lot. That vigilante is a force to be reckoned with, so I'm not surprised that he managed to defeat you. With a voice that was still calm, Mirio was surprised to hear this. Night Eye had told him about Dekoru before, but he never imagined that he would be so impressed by him. I can tell that something else is going on. What are you thinking about? Night Eye then asked, using his usual calm voice. Mirio had hoped that Night Eye wouldn't notice how distraught he was, but at the same time he wanted to talk about this. Ingenium's little brother tried to capture the vigilante, but he was defeated. The other officers began beating him up once they were on the scene, and they did so without remorse. The blonde said, sounding distraught as he said it. Night Eye held a stern expression as he asked, did he use his quirk in an attempt to capture Dekoru? With an equally stern voice, Mirio looked confused as he answered, yes, not knowing what Night Eye was going to say. The agent pushed his glasses back into place as he said, then it was deserved. Those things can't go unpunished. With a colder voice, Mirio was even more distraught now. Night Eye just condoned the act of beating up a teenager for virtually no reason. How could he agree with something like that? How can you say that? He's just 2 years younger than me, and he was related to one of your fellow agents. How is it right to almost kill someone just to prove a point? Mirio then said, with a voice that was serious. Night Eye looked at him with cold eyes, ones that Mirio had never seen before, as he said, because we exist to enforce the law. It's not enforcement if we take it lightly, or if we go easy on someone just because they're a friend. With an equally cold voice, Mirio just got angrier upon hearing this, as he said, what about Toshinori Yagi? Wasn't he your friend? With more anger in his voice, Night Eye reacted upon hearing this, as he stood up and shouted, who told you that name? With a hint of anger in his voice. Mirio didn't answer, but Night Eye still knew. He could figure out that Dekoru was responsible for all of this, and it only served to annoy him further. Toshinori was an idiot. He believed in a society that had no hope in existing. He refused to see the truth or reason, so I forced him to. The agent then said, showing his annoyance. Mirio just got more frustrated upon hearing this, as he said, you betrayed your own friend. With a passive-aggressive tone. Night Eye was unaffected by this, as he said, I tried to open his eyes, but he insisted on keeping them closed. With the same cold voice as before, Mirio didn't know what to say anymore, for he couldn't even recognize Night Eye anymore. The man he saw right now was not the one that he knew. Is that all, or do you have more things to say? The agent then asked, clearly annoyed by their argument. Mirio didn't answer Night-Eye before leaving through the door. The blonde made his way through the corridor with anger, for he couldn't do it any other way right now. Dekaroo was right. The AQTF was wrong. They had no issue with beating people half to death, even their own, and they don't feel bad about it. Night-Eye even betrayed his own friend. And all he can say about it is that his friend was an idiot. Mirio had enough. He couldn't stay any longer. He joined the AQTF so that he could help people, not become whatever monster Night-Eye was. If he wanted to help people, he would need to change his ways. And right now there was only one way he could think of doing that. About a month had passed since Midoriya confronted Stain, and they had finally decided to deal with him. The group decided that they couldn't trust him anymore, therefore they didn't let him patrol as much. The few times that he patrolled, they refused to leave him on his own, much to his own displeasure. The group were hard at work and managed to gain more and more supporters with time, but they could tell that bad things were coming. There were rumors about humanoid monsters attacking people in the dark, and that they were more brutal than any AQTF soldier. This made the group be very careful, for they could all tell that getting caught by one of those things might as well be game over. Other things that were happening was an increase in vigilantism. More people took to the streets in an effort to help others, and the group discussed the possibility of recruiting some of them. Looks like your plan worked like a charm, Dekaroo, Aizawa said, typing away at his laptop as he did. Midoriya held his newly healed finger as he answered, "Yeah, it almost worked too well. I'm a little concerned by the amount of people that are out there now." With a calm voice, Aizawa understood Midoriya's concern. The new amount of vigilantes will lead to an increase in strength by the AQTF, and that leads to the less experienced ones being caught. The tired man scrolled through the many articles of vigilantes, looking for interesting individuals, until Midoriya spoke up. "Hang on, what's that?" the green-haired vigilante said, as he pointed to the screen. Aizawa zoomed in on what Midoriya saw. A new vigilante with blonde hair and a mask that covered the lower part of his face. The green-haired boy recognized this person. It was the AQTF rookie that he had encountered 1 month ago, Lemillion. Midoriya looked at the image and read some of the text, until he said, "What are you doing?" to the person in the picture. Aizawa was confused, as he asked, "Do you know him?" With a curious voice, Midoriya scratched his chin as he answered, "Not really. I encountered him during one of my patrols last month. He was with the AQTF, and I think he was being trained by Night-Eye." With a strange voice, Aizawa was even more confused now, as he asked, "Why would he become a vigilante if he's with the AQTF?" With a voice that perfectly mirrored how confused he was, Midoriya kept thinking about it, until he said, "I don't know, but he seemed pretty naive. It was like he thought the AQTF was something that they weren't. So maybe he realized the truth and decided to defect." With the same voice as before, Aizawa had a little more understanding now, and it made him think of something. Or he could be trying to get our attention, in an attempt to track us down and capture us, the tired man said, his voice being calm. Midoriya understood Aizawa's concern. It was hard to believe that an AQTF agent would defect like that, so it made more sense if he knew that they were looking for people and tried to get their attention. Midoriya, however, felt that this wasn't something that Lemillion would do. He felt that maybe Lemillion realized his mistake and tried to make it right. "You know him better than I do, even if it isn't a lot, so you decide on what we do with him," Aizawa then said, knocking Midoriya out of his thoughts. The green-haired vigilante thought for another second, until he decided on what to do about Lemillion. Outro. Thank you all for sticking around, and I hope that you enjoyed. Before you leave, we would just like to let you know that We the Celestials has many other channels for your entertainment and viewing purposes. All the information you'll need is right below here in the description, so feel free to check out all the other incredible projects our team creates. Secondly, on behalf of We the Celestials, I'd like to thank everyone involved in the production of today's awesome content. Their details will be in the description below. That's all for today's video, so goodbye and have a divine day.